the German Messerschmitt Me 262. Sleek, fast, and heavily armed, it was a quantum leap in fighter technology. For the Allies, the appearance of the new swept-wing fighter caused a great deal of anxiety and consternation. Nothing they had could come close to its awesome performance.
The top Allied fighter at the end of the war was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. The Messerschmitt 262, which we captured and tested founder, had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. An advantage of almost 125 miles an hour, which means an aircraft with this performance, which is a quantum jump, can dictate terms of combat. It can initiate or finish combat as it wishes. It was a very formidable weapon indeed.
Considered by many to be the world's first jet fighter, it was in fact a distant second. Indeed, the first air-to-air kill credited to a jet fighter goes to the Gloucester Meteors of 616 Squadron RAF. On August 4, 1944, Flying Officer Dixie Dean, using the wingtip of his Meteor, toppled a V-1 flying bomb, sending it crashing into the ground. While the V-1 was a pilotless aircraft, it would still go down in history as the first jet versus jet encounter. It was a telling indictment. After a 21-month lead in jet fighter development, the Germans found themselves with just one design in production, the Me 262. By June 1944, only a handful were in service. But there was another jet fighter, one designed and built before the Me 262, the Heinkel HE-280. Designed by Ernst Heinkel, it was capable of over 500 miles per hour. At this late stage of the war, the HE-280 was nowhere to be seen. First flown in September of 1940, it was 2 years ahead of Willy Messerschmitt's Me 262. What happened? Was it simply indifference on the Luftwaffe's part, or was the promise of the HE-280 sabotaged by political interference, incompetence, or bitter personal rivalries? To find the answers, we must first look at the state of military aircraft design and production, beginning in the 1930s. Since the end of the First World War, aircraft engine horsepower steadily increased. At the beginning of the 1930s, new engine designs and the promise of the supercharger led to more and more horsepower. The new all-metal monocoque airplane revolutionized aircraft design. The possibilities seemed limitless. Speed, altitude, and range records were smashed. Military commanders saw great promise in these new designs, and as Europe crept toward war, orders for new bombers and fighters began to rise. With little time or money left for the development of any new or questionable propulsion systems, work focused on the evolution of the piston engine. Many engine builders called the idea of a jet engine the thing, technically unfathomable and little more than a pipe dream. But there were those whose pipe dreams would become reality. In 1930, Flying Officer Frank Whittle, RAF, applied for a patent for his jet engine. This was followed by Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain and his secret jet engine patent in 1935. Robert Pohl, a colleague of Ohain at the University of Göttingen, was instrumental in bringing Ohain's invention to the attention of leading German aircraft manufacturer Ernst Heinkel.
This man, Pohl was his name, he wrote to Heinkel, whom he knew. And he said, I have a man here who is into something which I think has a tremendous future to it. He is into jet propulsion. It's a continuous combustion engine. It draws air in the intake, compresses it, and then the combustion cans are sprayed with gasoline, and it turns a turbine wheel to keep the thing running, and the exhaust comes out the half end of it. As long as you give it fuel, it'll run forever. And he says, I have a man here who wrote a thesis about this sort of application for a jet engine. It pleased me very much if you would meet him and see him and talk to him about his ideas and his applications for future aircraft.
With Heinkel's backing, the German inventor created a line of experimental centrifugal flow jet engines, similar to Whittle's, each with ever more thrust. The entire program was conducted as a private venture and in the utmost secrecy. The German Air Ministry was kept in the dark. On the other hand, Heinkel was also unaware that BMW was working on their own jet engine. BMW's design was an axial flow unit. More complicated than the centrifugal design, it offered more power and greater efficiencies. It was also being developed with the full knowledge of the German Air Ministry. In time, axial flow designs would power Germany's fledgling jet force.
Early in the days before, immediately before the war, the Germans had become aware of the practicality of a jet-propelled engine as being pioneered by Frank Whittle. And at first, they followed the same concept as Whittle of centrifugal flow, which is the simplest form of jet engine, really, and also probably the most reliable at that stage, certainly, in the pioneering efforts. But eventually, they turned quite rapidly after their first, if you like, experiments onto the axial flow type, which really offers many advantages. And they concentrated thereafter totally on axial flow engines. And within the limitations of the strategic materials they had, they were very successful in this. The only problem was that the axial flow engine is complex and therefore difficult to produce, time-consuming to produce. And also, unless you have the right strategic materials to contain the heat stresses, it can have a rather short productive life.
Work on a suitable test airframe for Heinkel's revolutionary new power plant was conducted at the same time. By August 1939, both engine and airframe were ready. Heinkel's HE-178 was no masterpiece. The short fuselage and stubby, elliptical wooden wings did not exude a sense of speed. On August 27th, test pilot Erich Varsitz settled himself into the cramped cockpit of the tiny aircraft. Watched by Ernst Heinkel and a small group of mechanics, the HE-178 began to roll. The takeoff run was short. Climbing to 500 meters, Varsitz circled the airfield once and came in for a perfect landing. Total flight time, 7 minutes. History had been made. Wasting no time, Heinkel telephoned Ernst Udet, the chief of aircraft procurement and supply at the RLM, the Reich's Air Ministry. The response Heinkel received was far from enthusiastic. The world's first jet would have to wait. On September 1st, Germany plunges Europe into war. Long before 1939, the name Heinkel had become a household name in Germany. Indeed, Ernst Heinkel's Flugzeugwerk had gained a worldwide reputation despite considerable restrictions placed on German aviation by the Versailles Treaty of 1919. During the 1920s and 30s, Heinkel produced a number of new military types for countries like Sweden and Japan. With the rise of Hitler in 1933 and the expansion of the new Luftwaffe, the opportunities for Heinkel seemed endless. Orders for fighters and bombers began to pour in. While many of Heinkel's designs, like the HE-111 bomber, were very good, they lacked what he desired the most: speed. Heinkel was passionate about high-speed flight.
Well, Heinkel, he loved aircraft that flew fast. He wasn't all that into aircraft that were fighters, propeller-driven fighters and escorts and that sort of stuff, like the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt Bf-109. He was a man consumed by speed. The faster an aircraft knew, man, I'm for that.
Even before the first flight of the HE-178, he created the HE-176, the world's first rocket plane, in 1939. Unfortunately for Heinkel, official reaction was muted, and with the onset of war, all work on the project ceased.
Udet, Göring, and all those other people in the early Reichsluftfahrtministerium were propeller people. They believed airplanes that were driven by propellers and alternate engine systems. They said, no, an airplane flies best with propellers. And so Heinkel was looked upon as some kind of a crackpot. And the research he was doing on jet engines, they felt was just silly and waste of money. And so he never got any real support from the Nazi government.
Shortly after Hitler came to power, a new requirement for an ultra-modern single-seat monoplane fighter was issued. Heinkel's response was the HE-112, powered by a 695-horsepower Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. Its direct competition was the Messerschmitt Bf-109 V1, also powered by the same Kestrel engine. The results were very close. While the Bf-109 was slightly faster, the HE-112 had a tighter turning circle and superior field performance. Amid general surprise and many raised eyebrows, Messerschmitt was awarded the new contract.
The Heinkel 112 was the better airplane as a combat airplane, and Rechlin test pilots endorsed that view entirely. So there was no doubt that from the pilot's point of view, Heinkel's 112 was number one.
For Heinkel, it was a bitter disappointment. It also marked the beginning of a new and rocky relationship between the aircraft manufacturer and the German Air Ministry. Undeterred, Heinkel continued with his quest for speed. Despite the lack of enthusiasm from Ernst Udet and later Erhard Milch, the State Secretary, Reich Air Ministry, Heinkel pressed on with his privately funded HE-280 twin-jet fighter. At the same time, the Messerschmitt Design Bureau completed a new twin-jet design study for the German Air Ministry. Submitted on June 7, 1939, the new proposal was accepted. On March 1, 1940, a contract for 3 airframes was awarded with the official designation ME-262. Simultaneously, and in the face of official apathy, Heinkel was rewarded with a similar contract. Even before the official contract had been signed, Heinkel had in fact cut metal on the first HE-280 prototype. The HE-280 was a quantum leap in aircraft design. Aside from the jet propulsion, the HE-280 was equipped with the world's first ejection seat and a tricycle landing gear. Prior to its first flight, a series of aerodynamic tests were conducted. Fitted with dummy engine nacelles, the prototype was towed into the air by an HE-111 and subjected to a number of gliding test runs. By March 30, 1941, the HE-280 V1 was ready for its first flight. With just enough fuel for takeoff, the HE-280 lifted into the air. After a single low-altitude, low-speed circuit, the HE-280 made a safe landing. It was the world's first jet fighter, but the world didn't take notice.
The Heinkel 280 was a state-of-the-art machine which no one really appreciated.
Just as the Germans were developing their jet technology, the Allies had their own secret jet programs as well. In England, Frank Whittle, like Ernst Heinkel, was battling against the same government indifference. The new jets were not a high priority. Frank's persistence, however, finally paid off. On February 3, 1940, the British Air Ministry issued Britain's first jet aircraft contract. Gloucester's aircraft was selected to meet specification E-2839. Design of this new aircraft was a collaboration between Frank Whittle and Gloucester Aircraft. The new E-2839 was a low-winged monoplane with the engine mounted behind the cockpit and equipped with a tricycle undercarriage, just like the HE-280. Air for the engine was drawn in from the nose and passed through ducts on each side of the cockpit. Like the Heinkel HE-178, the Gloucester E-2839 was one of the world's first technology demonstrator aircraft. Its sole purpose was to flight test Whittle's W1 centrifugal jet engine, which developed a modest 860 pounds of thrust. A remarkable aircraft by any standard, 2 examples were built. On May 15, 1941, the first E-2839 took off from Cranwell Airfield at 7:45 p.m. The flight lasted just 17 minutes. The promise of Whittle's engine pushed the Air Ministry towards an operational jet fighter. Even before the first E-2839 took shape, specification F940 for a new jet fighter was finalized in December 1940. Because the new jet engine didn't have the required thrust, the new fighter would have to be a twin-engine design. The F940 was not a radical or advanced aerodynamic design. Following accepted aircraft practices, it was fairly conventional. On February 7, 1941, Gloster's received an order for 12 Gloster Whittle airplanes to the F940 specification. These would become the first Gloster Meteors. Back in Germany, parallel work on the Me-262 was not proceeding smoothly. When the contract for the prototype had been issued, it was obvious to Messerschmitt that BMW had been unduly optimistic. The new BMW 003 axial flow engine was still unreliable, without sufficient power. It also had a substantially larger diameter. In order to accommodate the new larger engine, Messerschmitt had to completely redesign his original airframe. The new aircraft would be larger, with the engines housed in underwing nacelles, just like the HE-280. While BMW struggled with their jet engine, the Junkers Aircraft Company was working on their own turbojet, the Jumo 004. This would provide a backup in case the BMW 003 failed. On November 1940, the Jumo 004 was bench tested for the first time. Major problems were revealed, and just as the HE-280 V1 made its first flight, Messerschmitt's first Me-262 V1 was fitted with a nose-mounted Junkers Jumo piston engine. It was not the start Willy Messerschmitt was hoping for. On April 5, 1941, the HE-280 was officially unveiled. To impress his guests, Heinkel arranged for a demonstration between a Focke-Wulf FW-190A and the HE-280. During the mock combat, the HE-280 completed 4 tight circles before the FW-190 completed 3. Finally, Ernst Udet showed some enthusiasm. Top speed was 485 miles per hour, 77 more than the FW-190. Impressed, the German Air Ministry sanctioned the manufacture of 13 HE-280A pre-production aircraft. Unfortunately for Heinkel, mass production of the HE-280 was still out of reach. Heinkel now found himself up against personal rivalries, duplication, and incompetent leadership. To understand this state of affairs, we have to return to the beginning of the new Luftwaffe. After Hitler took power, he appointed Hermann Göring as leader of the new Luftwaffe. A World War I ace and squadron commander, Göring soon gave a number of his ex-squadron mates titles in the newly formed Luftwaffe. Ernst Udet was one of the first. Many had no experience in aircraft production, or had any business background. By 1941, German aircraft manufacturing was in a crisis. Under the command of Ernst Udet, aircraft production had stalled. For the first year and a half of war, Germany was only producing 800 aircraft a month. It wasn't until after the Battle of Britain and the setbacks in Russia did the German High Command take action. Unfortunately for Udet, he was unable to effect any real change. In November 1941, he committed suicide. Udet's successor was Erhard Milch. Milch was an able, ruthless administrator, but he lacked the military expertise necessary for the job. Although he had good understanding of aircraft production, he was unimaginative and a conservative when it came to research and development. July 18, 1942. The first Me-262 is ready for its first flight. Unlike the HE-280, the Me-262 is a tail dragger. Because of the nose's high angle, most of the jet's thrust is wasted. After a problematic takeoff run, it takes to the air for a short 17-minute flight.
When the Messerschmitt 262 was first tested, it was a tail dragger. It had a tail wheel. And the only way you could get the thing up and level was for the pilot to put on the brakes, and so the aircraft would come up level, and then they could take off with it.
Across the Atlantic, America finally enters the jet age with the first flight of the Bell P-59A. The date is October 1st, 1942. By the summer of 1942, the HE-280 was still very much in the picture. In June, the HE-280 V2 prototype was re-engined with two Jumo 004A engines, each rated at 1,852 pounds of thrust. Now, for the first time, both the HE-280 and the Me-262 are equipped with the same type of engine. Flight trials proved promising, with a top speed of 491 miles an hour being reached. A true comparison of the two fighters could now be made. Flight testing of the fourth Me-262 prototype showed that with the same power plants, it enjoyed a marked performance advantage over the HE-280. Compared to the straight-wing HE-280, the Me-262 looked faster. Its shark-like appearance and swept-back wings gave it a menacing presence. Even with this apparent advantage, the Me-262 still had a long way to go. For Heinkel and Messerschmitt, the road ahead was not a simple one. Both had suffered serious setbacks, their reputations now in question. In Messerschmitt's case, his new Me-210 twin-engine fighter was a complete failure. For Heinkel, the intractable problems associated with the disastrous HE-177 heavy bomber was a major distraction. By the summer of 1942, Germany was still victorious. After some unexpected setbacks in Russia, they were once again on the offensive. In North Africa, the first Battle of El Alamein began with Erwin Rommel leading the way. From a military perspective, Germany was at the height of its power, but it was now fighting on three fronts. Losses would be heavy. In September, the Battle of Stalingrad began with much promise. It was a bloody battle of attrition, and one in which Germans were losing. On November 1st, Allied troops break out of El Alamein. 7 days later, Operation Torch begins. Allied troops invade North Africa, with American and British troops landing in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel's fabled Africa Corps is now being squeezed on two sides. November 19th. Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus. Its aim: surround the city of Stalingrad and annihilate all German forces. The Soviet offensive is a spectacular success, and by the end of January 1943, the battle is all but over. The German Sixth Army surrenders. It was the first Nazi acknowledgement of failure. In May, the battle for Tunisia is over. German and Italian forces surrender, with 250,000 troops taken prisoner. These military losses represented a key turning point. Germany was now on the defensive. For the Luftwaffe, January 1st, 1943 represented a time of crisis. Its operational strength had sunk to some 4,000 aircraft. It had also failed to introduce new, more modern types, aircraft like the HE-280 and the Me-262. In fact, the Luftwaffe was drawing on its last accumulated reserves. Contingency plans were non-existent. Any new military setback would be catastrophic. The German High Command had resolutely declined the possibility of waging a defensive war. From Hitler on down, the mantra had always been attack. The losses in Stalingrad and North Africa put a severe strain on Luftwaffe resources. For the first time, serious cracks began to show. But it wasn't just the losses in North Africa and Stalingrad that hobbled the once mighty Luftwaffe. The pre-war belief that Germany's military conquests would be short led to short-term planning. New modern aircraft wouldn't be needed. It was a strategic miscalculation, and one that had a direct effect on the development of Heinkel's HE-280 and Messerschmitt's Me-262.
Heinkel was up against the German Air Ministry, even though he had Ernst Udet as his very good friend and confidant. The German Air Ministry, they wanted a flying machine pellet built like the Focke-Wulf 190, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, that were designed for ground support, like in Poland and elsewhere.
For Heinkel, the battle for the HE-280 continued. As Germany's fortunes began to change, many still clung to the belief in a rapid victory, even in the second half of 1942. Erhard Milch was one of them. After Udet's suicide, he did manage to increase aircraft production, but at a cost. To avoid Hitler's wrath, Milch was unwilling to add any new types to the assembly lines. Doing so would cause monthly production numbers to fall. As a result, most of the pre-war designs remained in production right until the end of the war. Unfortunately for Heinkel and Messerschmitt, Milch's aversion to risk continued to have its effect in the one field where Germany could establish technical superiority: jet planes. In September 1942, both Erhard Milch and the German Air Ministry agreed. Any preparations for series production of the Me-262 would be premature, and in view of Heinkel's numerous commitments, production of the HE-280 was unrealistic as well. It was a curious point of view, but in early 1943, that all changed. In January 1943, Heinkel's HE-280 V6 prototype, powered by two Jumo 004 engines, took flight. For the first time, Heinkel pitched this version as a fighter bomber. In a complete about-face, the German Air Ministry changed its mind and began negotiations for the manufacture of 300 280s. It now seemed as if the 280 would finally see mass production and enter service before the Me-262. Ironically, the 262 V4 prototype, powered by the same Jumo 004 engines as Heinkel's new jet bomber, enjoyed a marked performance advantage over its rival. While the HE-280 was thought to be faster with a better rate of climb and ceiling, it only had 2/3 the range. In the end, the 262 was the superior fighter. In a letter dated March 27, 1943, Milch wrote to Heinkel, ending the 280 project. In Milch's letter, he claimed that the overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. For Heinkel, it was a bitter defeat. In a conference shortly after, Heinkel observed that Milch and his colleagues had a noticeable sense of unease about the jet, and the talk was always about jet bombers. For Willy Messerschmitt, victory over Heinkel would prove a Pyrrhic victory. Meanwhile in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor prototype DG-206 made its first flight. Like the Germans, British officialdom and industry were slow to deliver a reliable jet engine. Official confidence was shaken when the impellers on Whittle's W2B engine continually burst at high speed. This was eventually remedied with imported impellers from General Electric, who in 1941 built their own jet engines based on Whittle's design. Fortunately for the program, Rolls-Royce was called upon to take over development and production of the W2B engine. Back in Germany, development of the Me-262 continued. Compared to the British, the German program was disorganized, inefficient, and veiled in secrecy, even from those who should have known. Surprisingly, Adolf Galland, general of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was kept in the dark. Not until May 22, 1943, did he fly the 4262 prototype. Galland was so impressed that he recommended production of the Bf-109 be halted and changed to the new jet fighter. Galland's enthusiasm swept away any remaining hesitancy and vacillation. 72 hours later, Erhard Milch ordered the 262 into series production. But many questions remained. Why did those involved in the program not see the value of the 262 sooner and act before Galland's endorsement? Why was it kept secret from Galland? And why didn't he fly the HE-280? One can only speculate as to what might have been if just 2 years earlier he had flown the 280. Finally, Messerschmitt had what he wanted, but there was one man who didn't agree. Adolf Hitler rejected out of hand any mass production of the Me-262. Said Hitler, "Nothing will be done with the new jet until I have decided on its merits." Unfortunately for Messerschmitt, the Fuhrer was increasingly obsessed with revenge and retribution. Striking back at the enemy was far more important than providing his fighter arm with a fighter capable of defending the Reich. This would lead directly to Germany's third jet-powered aircraft, the V-1 flying bomb. Powered by a pulse jet engine, the V-1 was the world's first cruise missile and the first jet-powered aircraft to see combat in World War II. Shortly after D-Day, the V-1 bombardment of London began. To help counter the threat, the RAF deployed the first jet fighter, the Meteor Mark I. Compared to the HE-280 and the Me-262, the Meteor was slower. But more importantly, it was a combat-ready machine powered by centrifugal jet engines. Though the German axial flow engine offered more punch, Frank Whittle, the genius behind Britain's early jet engines, was sold on the reliability of centrifugal design.
Now, axial flow engines are much more complex than centrifugal, but much more efficient. Ideally, one should have headed for axial flow. But one has to put oneself back a bit in time and remember where we stood in the history of jet development, and that was not very far along the road. Whittle, quite rightly, when I talked to him, he knew all about axial flow, but I said to him, "Why have you gone this way, Frank, into centrifugal?" And he said, "Because in this present state of the art, I am looking for reliability and simplicity."
In November 1943, Hitler saw the Me-262 for the first time. Hitler scolded those in attendance, asking why, after years of demanding a fast bomber, was he presented with a fighter? Hitler wanted to know if the jet aircraft could carry bombs. Messerschmitt answered in the affirmative. For Hitler, the matter was settled. The Me-262 would be produced as a blitz bomber. In fact, Messerschmitt disobeyed Hitler and continued to develop his jet solely as a fighter. 6 months later, when Hitler found out, he flew into an incandescent rage. On May 25, 1944, he ordered all 262s to be built as bombers. It was a major blow and added more technical problems to an already troubled program. One of the biggest and ongoing hurdles was the development of the Jumo 004 engine into a reliable power plant. The Jumo 004 was an axial flow compressor design. In theory, it offered more power over the higher drag centrifugal compressor engines used by the British. In practice, however, the Jumo engines were considerably inferior. The shortage of strategic materials like chrome and nickel led to the failure of many substandard turbine blades at high temperatures. The Jumo 004 also suffered from decreased thrust at high altitude, fuel flow problems, and flameouts if the throttle was opened or closed too quickly. The Jumo 004 was a technical and operational failure. Not only did the Jumo 004 have a very short lifespan, it was unreliable, prone to surges, stalls, and fires. This was the Me-262's Achilles heel, one Allied pilots would feast on.
The engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, the designers hadn't thought of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the 262s they picked off was usually in that phase of the operation.
By July 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was fighting a losing battle. Unable to cope with the swarms of long-range American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, it was quickly being destroyed. While the Me-262 was in production, the numbers in operational service were meager at best, and would remain so until the end of the war. The first American B-17 shot down didn't occur until August 15th. For the Germans, the situation was desperate. Shut out since the rejection of the HE-280, Ernst Heinkel was finally brought back into the jet fold. Concerned with the slow production of the Me-262, the German High Command wanted a so-called rush job, a single-engine jet fighter that required little strategic materials to build. For Heinkel, it was a question of pride. Eager to prove himself once more, he accepted the challenge. Heinkel quickly realized that in order for the jet to work, the engine had to be mounted just above the fuselage, similar to the V-1. 12 days after the specification had been issued, the HE-162 mock-up was ready. On September 23, 1944, Heinkel's HE-162 was selected for mass production. Captain Eric Brown recalls demonstrating the HE-162 to Heinkel in a post-war test flight.
He was like a schoolboy jumping up and down with delight and asked very piercing questions about the handling of the aircraft. He had heard about the disaster we'd had with it. I found him with a very acute mind and struck me as a highly intelligent person.
By late 1944, the German High Command was fueled by fear, fantasy, and pathological denial. Galland said that the HE-162 was unrealistic. To mass-produce such a crude and untried aircraft and expect it to be flown by inexperienced Hitler youth was beyond reality. Even at this late stage of the war, Heinkel was working on at least 26 different versions. Using slave labor, 100 aircraft were produced in February of 1945. On February 6th, the first group converted to the new type. In the final weeks of the war, the so-called People's Fighter saw little action. Combat claims were made but never confirmed. Only one HE-162 was ever shot down by an Allied fighter. On May 5th, Germany surrendered. It was a crushing defeat. The new jet and rocket fighters introduced late in the war had no impact on the outcome. Many have argued that if the HE-280 had been produced sooner, history would have been different. Perhaps, but in the final analysis, the 280 wouldn't have made a dramatic difference. For Ernst Heinkel, there was a deep bitterness. His early groundbreaking developments were essentially ignored. As to who actually killed the world's first jet fighter, the answer is many. The HE-280 was quite simply a victim of mismanagement and industrial chaos. After 1936, Nazi management of the aviation industry was not centralized. Udet's technical office, Göring, the general staff, Milch, and all the aircraft designers jockeyed with one another for control of the aviation program. Instead of a uniform, consistent policy towards aircraft production, confusion and chaos reigned.
Göring must hugely accept blame for a lot of the failings of the Luftwaffe, particularly the delay and the mismanaging getting aircraft into production. And to a large extent, Udet was one of his causes of his problem. Udet was an extroverted, magnificent exhibition pilot in civil life. And he had been in Göring's squadron in World War I. Ernst Udet had no interest in politics, and Göring approached him as an old squadron mate and said, you know, the Nazi Party needs you and your experience. Come in and be the head of our technical department. Udet was talked into this and was completely out of his depth.
Firms like Heinkel and Messerschmitt tried to build everything from trainers to strategic bombers. Every effort made by the Air Ministry to move them towards any specialization was effectively countered. Clear-cut technical objectives were never issued. Programs were allowed to continue regardless of the enormous waste in time, skill, and materials. Overall, the Nazi management of the aircraft industry was uncoordinated, inefficient, plagued by ignorance and incompetence. Even if the HE-280 had become operational in 1942, its overall effectiveness would have been limited. It all came down to the Jumo 004 power plant. Unreliable with a critically short lifespan, it was not ready for combat operations. Serviceability rates would have been low, as was the case with the Me-262. Finding good pilots would have been another issue. The number of newly trained pilots could barely keep pace with attrition. Fuel shortages also began to take hold. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was a dying force with no chance of recovery. As the world's first jet fighter, Heinkel's HE-280 was a marvel of technology and inspiration. Unfortunately for Heinkel, those in power saw little use for his twin-jet fighter. Hitler's reluctance to produce jets almost certainly doomed what little hope Germany had of ever producing an effective jet fighter force. As the Allies sifted through the spoils of their victory, the incredible technology left behind, they counted themselves lucky that Germany had recognized the potential of jet power too late.
The jets were left absolutely untouched. Now, I was puzzled about this, frankly. What had motivated this? It certainly wasn't because it was overrun too quickly for them to have got rid of these jet aircraft. I think, deep down, it was a sense of pride of what they had achieved in the technical field, and they wanted us to see it.
For decades, numerous historians have studied the Luftwaffe and its failures during the Second World War. What caused an air force that was in many ways vastly superior to the Allies to come crashing down? Is there a distinct turning point that made Germany's aerial arsenal impotent against the combined strength of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union? For the first time ever, put yourself right in the middle of the debate as we try to solve the greatest arguments in the history of aviation. What caused the Luftwaffe to fail? In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and later the Führer, enacting complete control over the fatherland. Eager to reclaim the lost territories taken from Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi war machine realizes early on that the formation of a strong air force is vital. In 1935, it becomes official on paper, and the Luftwaffe is born. The man put in charge of this department is Hermann Göring, a prominent ace from the Great War.
Goering was a World War I fighter pilot. He was not interested in technology. He said something at one point, he said, well, this device is a box with coils, and I don't like boxes with coils. He still had this sort of, well, if you're courageous and brave, you don't have to worry about technological gizmos.
In building this new air force, the Nazis possess many advantages that other nations do not, including a first-class aircraft industry, symbolized by the names Messerschmitt, Dornier, Heinkel, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. Brilliant engineers capable of taking aerodynamics to a whole new level, and a highly educated population that can build aircraft on a mass scale. By 1938, production rises to over 5,000 planes. 1 year later, that figure soars to over 8,000, a testament to the importance Nazis place on the doctrine of air power.
What the Germans were trying to do was to employ new machines, new technologies, but to employ them in the service of a very, very old way of war that had served them well in previous conflicts and they felt would continue to serve them well in the future. I think this sets the Germans somewhat apart from neighboring countries in the 1920s and 1930s in that they are not truly looking ahead as much as they are looking back to their old traditions and grafting new technologies onto them.
Before war is declared in August of 1939, Germany's aerial arsenal is impressive to say the least. Ready to go is the Me-109, a superior single-engine fighter, the Junkers 87 Stuka, a terrifying dive bomber, the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17 Flying Pencil, two top-of-the-line medium-range bombers. This, in addition to the largest air transport industry in the entire world, exemplified by the Junkers 52, a workhorse that will be at the centerpiece of the German offensive. Even with all these phenomenal aircraft, a key ingredient is missing, as is often noted by Second World War historians: the absence of strategic bombers. This void does not go unnoticed in 1935, when General Walter Wever, realizing their importance, enthusiastically supports the building of long-range aircraft to battle any potential enemy, most likely the Soviet Union.
General Walter Wever was promoting what he called the Urals bomber. He believed that the industrialization, tanks, planes, etc., that was going on in the Urals area had to be demolished if you were going to win a war against Russia.
Wever writes, "Air power carries the war right into the heart of enemy country from the moment war breaks out. It strikes at the very root of the enemy's fighting power and of the people's will to resist."
Yeah, Walter Wever was very much in favor of this long-distance bomber to try and bomb Russia. And that actual project was given the name of the Ural bomber. Wever actually then put specifications out to both Dornier and Junkers for the building of this long-range bomber. Out of this came the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89. But neither of these aircraft had the performance that was currently available in the United States of the B-17 Flying Fortress. So therefore, neither of those airplanes really progressed very far beyond a couple of prototypes.
Dying due to a plane crash in 1936, his doctrine, epitomized by the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89, are scrapped by Goering.
Goering, I think, didn't go along with this because he rather took the view that Hitler had, that they could win by blitzkrieg, and they wouldn't be required to get into this lengthy process of using heavy bombers.
Inquiring as to how many twin-engine planes can be made for every four-engine one, the answer given to him is 2.5. The Field Marshal's response is that the Führer does not ask me how big my bombers are, but how many there are. It is important to note that the decision not to build long-range bombers cannot be considered a failure. For Germany, the raw materials needed to build such planes would require large amounts of rubber, metals, and fuel, all of which would have to be imported for a hefty price. Of the 4,500 tons of aluminium needed per month for aircraft production, only half is available during the Wever era. The Air Force that he and others envisioned was simply uneconomic at the time. What truly represented the German way of war is instead a tactical Air Force.
The German War of Movement attempted to defeat as much of the enemy army as possible within the opening weeks of fighting. So the tactical level of fighting for an individual position, and then the operational level of attempting to defeat an enemy army. But arguably, Germany had never been very good, and this would go back to Prussia before it, at the kind of long-term strategic planning that the Allies were so skilled at in World War II. Arguably, this was because the Germans felt they had to win all their wars quickly or they would not win them at all, and that attempting to play strategic warfare with the vast economic and industrial resources of the United States was a losing game from the start.
Working closely with those on the ground, the Luftwaffe is wildly successful as the Second World War begins. Poland is easily demolished. Norway is taken away from the British effortlessly. The Low Countries and even the power of France cannot resist German might during the year 1940. It appears that nothing can stop Nazi forces from gobbling up the continent of Europe.
Certainly the Luftwaffe played an extremely important part in the opening German victories of World War II. And when we say opening victories, we don't mean the first 6 months, we mean the first 2 years, in which it looked like a German victory is very much in the offing. The German Air Force was very skilled at the tactical level, that is, cooperation with the ground forces. It was extremely successful at the operational level of war, the intermediate level, that is, carrying out campaigns against enemy supply lines, for example, feeding troops and men to the front.
With the fall of France, Britain is the only nation standing in the way of this German juggernaut. In order to finish off the rebellious island nation, a plan known as Operation Sea Lion is approved. It calls for the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. Once this is completed, German forces will be deployed onto British soil. However, during this pivotal battle, the Luftwaffe is dealt its very first aerial defeat. Primarily through the use of Spitfires and Hurricanes, the English are able to push back German planes from the coast of Britannia. While this monumental struggle ensues, we discover one of the Luftwaffe's greatest failure, its lack of coordination with the Kriegsmarine.
Goering said, "Everything that flies is mine," and bitterly fought against any attempts by the German Navy to get a hold of a piece of the air action. When they wanted long-range aircraft assigned to them, Goering, actually, Dönitz went behind Goering's back directly to Hitler, and I think got a dozen of the Focke-Wulf Condors assigned to him. Goering, when he found out about this, was furious and actually cut off all cooperation with the Kriegsmarine at this point.
Despite pleas by Admiral Raeder to create a separate air force for the Navy, Goering refuses to give the green light to any potential inter-service rival. The roots for this conflict come from each service's desire to be recognized as the one who brought victory to the fatherland.
Of course, there has always been the rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force from the point of view that we refer to ourselves as the Imperial Navy and refer to the Air Force as the Nazi Air Force. So that differentiated us already in attitude and character.
In hindsight, Goering's decision proves fatal, as Germany and Britain battle it out in both the skies and on the high seas. Winston Churchill would write that the greatest threat to Britain was the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boat submarines are enormously successful in sinking English shipping.
I think Churchill was quite correct that the Battle of the Atlantic was the one front where Britain could really lose the war because they were so dependent on supplies, even food, coming from North America, that if that lifeline was cut, Britain would have been really in dire straits.
With the defeat of France, bases are built right on their coast, giving these vessels an even bigger theatre to disrupt the lifeline of Britain. Had aerial forces worked closely with these U-boats, or if a separate naval aviation wing was created, it would be a game-changer in Germany's war against Britain. Proof of this can be seen in the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, an aircraft that, despite its limitations, is excellent in attacking English ships. With no more than a dozen planes, they successfully sink 85 merchant vessels and over 300,000 tons of shipping.
When the Germans started to deploy a fairly small number of the Focke-Wulf 200 Condors to attack Allied shipping, they were able to have really a devastating effect.
Also, had the new invention of a magnetic mine been dropped by Luftwaffe planes into the English Channel, its enemy could have been starved out of the war. This marks the first major failure of the Luftwaffe.
It was our common complaint of us, the little people, let's say, that there was no coordination whatsoever between the German Navy and the German Air Force.
With a stalemate on the Western Front, Germany decides to keep the British at bay and instead focus attention on their ally, the Soviet Union. Enacting a war plan known as Operation Barbarossa, some 3 million Nazi soldiers equipped with rifles, tanks, and planes begin the biggest land assault in history. Using less than 3,000 aircraft, a force smaller than that utilized in the battle against France, Germany is miraculously able to push back Soviet forces to the suburbs of Moscow. The decision to launch Operation Barbarossa exposes the Luftwaffe to its second major failure, the lack of maintenance and repair on the ground. When a German aircraft is damaged, it is sent back to the fatherland for repair. When fighting a relatively short and tactical war against France, this particular system works fairly well. When fighting a long drawn-out war of attrition against the communists, however, it proves to be a gigantic blunder. In the Soviet Union, with the fighting taking place far away from the major cities of Germany, the time it takes engineers to repair a damaged aircraft and have it sent back to the front is enormous. And by 1941, less than 30% of the Luftwaffe's airfields are operational, a fact that is almost inconceivable when taken into account that Germany is fighting a two-front struggle. As Field Marshal Erhard Milch would reflect after the war, the vertical organization in 4 territorial determined Luftflotte commands was grossly inadequate for launching a war well beyond the borders of the Third Reich. The attack of June 22, 1941 would in retrospect be a catastrophic mistake. For those like Goering, men who had never fought on the Eastern Front during the First World War, they would grossly underestimate the Soviet will and the industrial capacity of a regime thought to be so backwards by Hitler. Moving its factories far beyond the Ural Mountains, they are out of range of German bombers. The ghost of General Wefer comes back to haunt the Luftwaffe. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany declares war against the United States. Before this decision is made, Hitler shrugs off any suggestion of a possible American threat in the form of an arsenal of democracy. In declaring war, Hitler foolishly adds yet another enemy to the Third Reich's list, one with a production capacity that is unparalleled. With 2 oceans separating America from the fighting, its people can go on producing without the threat of bombardment. Britain would have hauled the flag down long ago if it had not been for America's support, one field marshal said. With Germany by this time experiencing severe shortage of aluminium and copper, America is fully stocked of these and other vital raw materials. By 1944, the United States is able to churn out over 96,000 planes per year, 1 every 5 minutes, more than double that of the Germans. Before this catastrophic decision is made, it is important to note that by 1940, even Britain, with its shipping being torpedoed at an unprecedented rate, is outproducing Germany in aircraft. The British are able to improvise, and as a result produce outstanding planes like the de Havilland Mosquito, an aircraft made from plywood. In contrast, by 1941, with Nazi forces engaged in a two-front war, total production is just over 11,000 planes, a yearly increase of only 3,000 from when the war began. It is clear that the Third Reich's total output is only a fraction of what it could be.
One of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended.
This lack of planning and foresight can be attributed to the man who took control of Luftwaffe production in 1936, long before the war began. His name is Ernst Udet. An outstanding ace from the First World War, he is put in control by Goering, replacing Wilhelm Wimmer. His appointment to this powerful position marks the third, and possibly the greatest failure of the Luftwaffe.
Goering placed one of his World War I fighter ace buddies, Ernst Udet, in charge of technical developments. Udet really didn't know anything about this stuff.
Udet's forerunner, Wimmer, has been outstanding in overseeing the Luftwaffe's second-generation aircraft during the pre-war era, including the Me-109, the Junkers 87, and the Heinkel 111. With Udet as his replacement, however, the next line of aircraft is a far cry from their predecessors.
One of his hobby horses was dive bombers. He had seen, actually, in America, interestingly, between the wars, a demonstration of dive bombing, thought every German bomber should be made into a dive bomber, and then even ordered this new 4-engine bomber, Heinkel 177, under development, to be made into a dive bomber. Well, Heinkel himself, who was, after all, an engineer who understood this, kept trying to talk him out of it, said this is ridiculous, but was overruled. And so they had to go back and strengthen the wings of the 177 to try to reduce drag so it could actually dive at high speeds. they tried mounting the engines in pairs. Instead of having 4 engines like you would normally think you would do on a bomber, they were mounted front and back in a single pod on each wing. This resulted in so much heat being generated that the engines were constantly overheating. So it really, I mean, it was a crazy idea, and it led directly to delays, and I guess you can really say the ultimate failure of Germany to field an effective 4-engine bomber during the war.
The Heinkel 177, with its odd tandem engine arrangement and an insane requirement by Udet to dive bomb, makes this plane a complete disaster from start to finish. The aircraft becomes known as the dead racehorse, with only a handful ever getting the chance to fly.
The Heinkel 177 and the Me-210 go hand in hand as one of the Luftwaffe's major disasters.
The Messerschmitt 210, a replacement for the Me-110, is full of problems that are never ratified.
When he came up with his Messerschmitt 210, the RLF said, "Oh yes, that's very good. Let's immediately we'll order 10,000. Or whatever it was. But they went into mass production and the thing had hardly flown. It was a complete and utter disaster for Messerschmitt, which he'd never lived down. And they had to convert a lot of the built Me-210s into Me-410s by taking the aeroplanes to pieces again and reassembling them with new parts to turn it into a flyable and operational machine.
As one aircraft representative is overheard saying, "Everything turns to dust in Udet's hands." Only one aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190, is considered a success under his watch. A reluctance to make the hard decisions also proves costly, as resources are diverted to projects that are simply unfeasible during wartime. By 1941, the need is for long-range strategic bombers, with America producing the B-17 Flying Fortress and the British reworking the Avro Manchester into the 4-engine Avro Lancaster. Germany, in contrast, falls dramatically behind the Allies in producing 4-engine bombers. Udet, with all his failures, commits suicide in 1941, leaving the Luftwaffe in shambles. With a Soviet victory at Stalingrad, German forces are pushed back, marking the beginning of the end. And as American and British bombers begin destroying German factories and city centers from the sky, the philosophy that General Weber endorsed years ago is coming true. Strategic bombing is proving vital in weakening the German war machine. Under the command of Field Marshal Erhard Milch, production is able to climb to 25,000 planes a year, a respectable increase, but nothing compared to what the Allies are able to produce.
U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy, embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
In 1944, Germany is being outmaneuvered in the realm of aircraft by the rate of over 4 to 1. At this point, there is simply no way to compete with the United States or the Soviet Union. While much is written by historians about Allied coordination in resources and materials, little can be found about Germany's willingness to use its own allies' means of production to their advantage. This is yet another failure of the German Luftwaffe. Without a common goal and being on different sides of the world, the Empire of Japan cannot be considered Germany's biggest ally. Its most powerful friend during the war is instead the Italians. Unfortunately, with their own air force in shambles, the Nazis are reluctant to give them the licenses and the engines to build German planes on Italian soil. This proves to be a pivotal mistake, as Italy could have tripled aircraft production with German assistance, producing possibly 30,000 planes during the war. Also, Italian factories would have been out of bombing range for the Allies during the year 1942 and might have changed the outcome in the Mediterranean. Germany's other allies, Romania, Hungary, and Finland, are all capable of making aircraft, but lack the knowledge and resources that the fatherland can provide. Had these nations been granted licenses to build Nazi aircraft on their own soil, there was a good chance that this coalition might have tipped the scale in favor of Germany during its pivotal battle against the Soviets during 1941. The decision not to fully utilize the resources of these nations can be attributed to Germany's desire to be the dominant power. There is widespread resentment against the Italians by top Nazi leaders who see them as merely riding off the coattails of German success.
Our feeling always was, with the experience of the First World War already, we wish the Italians were on the other side.
People like Hermann Goering see these smaller countries as the providers of natural resources, with the fatherland supplying the finished products. This marks another tragic failure of the Luftwaffe. In early 1944, Germany unveils the Messerschmitt 262, a revolutionary jet plane that can hopefully take down the flying fortresses and mosquitoes that are destroying their cities.
Later on, of course, they produced the world's first production model, general use jet aircraft in the form of the Messerschmitt 262, the Me 262. The Me 262 as a pure fighter was an amazing sight to see, and in fact, anyone looking at it today is still struck by the modern and sleek lines.
Now, the Me 262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II.
The Me 262 is years ahead of its time, symbolizing the fatherland's creativity and innovation. In many ways, however, the Me 262 also symbolizes Nazi indecision.
Unfortunately, the Me 262 got caught in a very, very arcane and difficult procurement process within Germany, wherein basic designs were put forward by competent engineers. They were then changed by upper echelons within the Luftwaffe, and of course they had to pass the Hitler test. And no aircraft passed the Hitler test without being significantly modified. The Me 262 is no exception.
After Professor Messerschmitt tells Hitler that the aircraft can carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, Field Marshal Milch, in a fit of rage, tells the Führer that even the smallest infant can see that the 262 is a fighter, not a bomber. After months of wavering, the plane goes ahead as a fighter-bomber, taking the sting out of what could have been a ferocious punch. They may possess this wonder weapon, but have few men that can fly it. This becomes the Luftwaffe's final failure, its pilots' lack of training. During its heyday, Germany's finest were given approximately 250 hours of flight time before being sent out to face their enemy, considerably more than the British. And with the Second World War going exceedingly well during 1940 and 1941, the Luftwaffe arrogantly minimizes its training program, figuring that the war will soon be over. By 1942, as the tide begins turning, German pilots are given less than 200 hours of practice flying, while Allied pilots are given over 300. With the war turning against them, shortcuts are made to churn out every single pilot possible. Despite this augmentation, by 1944 the average training time drops to just under 100 hours. In some cases, just a quarter of what P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots were given. With air superiority lost over German soil, it becomes a turkey shoot for American and British aviators as they begin gunning down Me-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s with ease.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied Tactical Aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters over the landing beaches. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by that.
The decision not to build a pilot training infrastructure like its enemies causes the Luftwaffe to run desperately short on experienced men. So by the time planes like the Me 262, the Arado 234 jet bomber, the Me 163, a rocket-powered interceptor, the Dornier 335 Arrow, the fastest piston engine plane of the Second World War, and all the other revolutionary aircraft that could have been the difference maker on both fronts, it is a case of too little, too late. The defeat of the Luftwaffe can be attributed to its lack of direction. With the war going in Germany's favor, Hitler, Goering, and Udet were blinded by a false optimism. That tactical war doctrine that they favored initially was being replaced by a long, drawn-out strategic war that they were ill prepared for. The arrogant nature in which they brushed off the industrial power of the United States and the Soviet Union. The mismanagement of their own country's aircraft industry on a grand scale, and the lack of infrastructure, production, and training during the Second World War's most decisive years would cause the Luftwaffe to write its own epitaph.
In June of 1942, a pivotal naval confrontation unfolded, marking one of the most significant battles of World War II as the United States of America faced off against the Japanese Empire. Fought exclusively with aircraft carriers positioned hundreds of miles apart, the Battle of Midway represented a groundbreaking naval conflict. It marked the inaugural major fleet engagement where opposing fleets never closed the gap to visually spot each other's ships. Victory or defeat depended not on the big guns of battleships, but on the carrier-borne bombers and torpedo bombers flying over vast tracts of ocean to seek and destroy their targets. Midway was the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. The Battle of Midway held paramount significance for Japan, as it was envisioned as the pivotal element in a grand strategy aimed at expanding the empire's territorial reach deep into the Pacific. Midway Island, a crucial American stronghold, was slated for assault and occupation, while the United States Pacific Fleet, en route to defend it with its scarce aircraft carriers, would fall into an ambush, leading to its annihilation. Should the remaining vestiges of American naval might be ultimately shattered, Japanese dominance over the Pacific would remain unassailable for the foreseeable future. In fact, in the Battle of Midway, the Japanese carrier fleet, the mightiest in existence, was utterly destroyed, and Japan suffered her greatest defeat for over 300 years. During the Battle of Midway, Japan, at the zenith of its military strength, suffered not only a significant naval defeat, but also, in the span of a single day, sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire, leading it toward downfall and defeat. Since the early 1930s, Japanese conquests in China had caused ever-increasing friction with the United States. Starting in mid-1940, the United States imposed a prohibition on the export of arms, scrap iron, and other critical strategic resources to the Japanese Empire. Then, in July 1941, America led an international oil embargo and froze all Japanese overseas assets. The effect was devastating. Up to now, 90% of Japan's oil had been imported, and her stockpiles were rapidly dwindling. As time grew scarce, the Japanese leadership made a momentous choice to embark on invasions and conquests of neighboring regions abundant in oil and other essential raw materials. First, a major obstacle would have to be eliminated: the American Pacific Fleet, anchored at Hawaii. In the early hours just prior to dawn on December 7, 1941, a fleet of 360 bombers and fighters took off from Japanese aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Hawaii. Their target was the 3 carriers and the 8 battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet, based in Pearl Harbor. In the span of just 2 hours, a total of 18 American warships, including 6 battleships, were sent to the depths, while an additional 90 vessels sustained damage from bombs or torpedoes. Almost 200 planes were destroyed on the ground, and over 3,500 U.S. personnel killed or wounded. The Japanese lost only 29 aircraft. It was a stunning victory. Shortly after noon the next day, the United States declared war on the Japanese Empire. Following the devastation of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the path was cleared for the Japanese campaign of expansion and conquest. In advance of the impending onslaught, garrisons across the region had covertly bolstered their defenses, and thousands of troops had been assembled and readied for action. In the hours following the Pearl Harbor raid, Japanese aircraft launched attacks on American air bases located at Wake Island, Guam, and Luzon in the Philippines. With complete air superiority, the Japanese launched their invasions. Forces in French Indochina, already held by the Japanese, rapidly advanced into Thailand and Burma. Troops from the island of Hainan landed in Malaya. On that very day, an initial raiding force commenced the invasion of the Philippines, swiftly followed by larger-scale landings. Over the next 3 weeks, Wake Island and Hong Kong fell to the Japanese. Borneo and Caleb were invaded and Sumatra was occupied. On February the 19th, Japanese aircraft carriers launched a lightning raid on Port Darwin in northern Australia, sinking 12 merchant ships and eliminating Darwin as a valuable Allied base. Early March saw the climax of the Japanese expansion, the inevitable occupation of Java. In a little over 3 months, Japan had conquered 1/4 of the Pacific Ocean. By securing a stable oil supply and expanding the defensive perimeter around their homeland, Japan had successfully accomplished all of its immediate wartime objectives. Yet in spite of the breathtaking scale of the Japanese victories, there did remain one major threat to the security of her Pacific conquests. 3 aircraft carriers from the United States Pacific Fleet managed to elude the devastation at Pearl Harbor, and within a matter of weeks, each of them served as a central core for a newly formed task force. After minor raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, 2 of the American carriers set sail on one of the most audacious missions of the Pacific War: to bomb Tokyo, the heart of the Japanese Empire. In early April 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet embarked on a westward journey from the U.S. Naval Base in Alameda, California, to meet up with its sister ship, the Enterprise, which was sailing from Pearl Harbor. With adept maneuvering to bypass the protective string of Japanese-controlled islands, both the Hornet and the Enterprise managed to penetrate to a point within 825 miles of Japan's coastline. At 8:24 on the 18th of April, 16 Mitchells took off from the Hornet and struck a course for the Japanese capital. Flying low, they avoided Japan's fighter defenses, and 15 aircraft dropped their bombs on the city. All but one of the Mitchells escaped to safety in mainland China or Russia. Following the attack, famously referred to as the Doolittle Raid, which took its name from its commander, Japanese military leaders were deeply alarmed and concerned. Even though the raid had inflicted only minor physical damage, it delivered a significant blow to Japan's sense of national pride. The need to protect the emperor was at the very core of the armed forces' being, and an agony of shame swept through the high command. Japan's leaders swiftly arrived at the conclusion that there was just one means by which they could ensure the adequate protection of homeland and the emperor. The frontiers of the empire must be pushed even further into the Pacific. In October 1941, General Hideki Tojo had been appointed Prime Minister of Imperial Japan. In his role as the Army Chief of Staff, Tojo harbored a profound ambition to witness the successful culmination of the Japanese campaign in China. He firmly believed that the sole path to achieving this goal was to secure a decisive victory over the Western powers. On his appointment as Prime Minister, General Tojo had kept his post as Chief of Staff and the job of War Minister. However, although an immensely powerful figure, Tojo did not have the complete control of government policy. Within a cabinet comprising representatives from all branches of the armed forces, he could rely primarily on the backing of the army. Consequently, most decisions ultimately resulted from a compromise between the army and the navy. Even prior to the Doolittle Raid, expanding the empire's boundaries into the Pacific had been a cherished aspiration of a powerful naval faction. After the raid, arguments between the army and navy evaporated. Because the proposed operation would demand little army participation, Tojo finally gave his support. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been elected President of the United States in 1932. Strongly against the prevailing sentiment of isolationism, Roosevelt had the conviction that America should actively engage on the global stage. Even before the outbreak of war in Europe, Roosevelt had warned of the dangers posed by Nazi Germany's ambitions. Following the German conquest of the continent in 1940, Roosevelt, despite facing domestic opposition, progressively bolstered his support for Britain in its battle for survival. It was also Roosevelt who, in relation for Japanese actions against China, had imposed the oil and trade embargo on Japan. As a former Assistant Secretary to the Navy and now its Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt took a special interest in the service. He handpicked his own flag officers and staff members, driven by his unwavering belief that the Navy should be led by the most qualified individuals for the roles. In a testament to his commitment to competence, he appointed Frank Knox, a member of the opposition Republican Party, to head the Navy Department. Under Roosevelt and Knox, the naval budget steadily rose. Even following the events at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt maintained a belief that ran contrary to the desires of the American public. He believed that a war in Europe should take precedence over actions in the Pacific. He understood that enormous resources would be needed to push back the tide of the Japanese conquest, and until the full might of American industry could be brought to bear. The United States would have to concentrate on holding the line. Roosevelt insisted that further Japanese expansion must be counted at all costs. The Imperial High Command anticipated that the expansion of the Japanese defense perimeter in the Pacific, while presenting logistical complexities, would pose minimal substantive challenges. On the islands to be invaded, enemy forces were weak, and at sea, it seemed there was little to fear from the Americans or the British. The Japanese Navy, the diving force behind the plan, was supremely confident. The first stage of the Japanese plan of conquest was to complete the occupation of New Guinea. As of April 1942, a portion of New Guinea had already fallen under Japanese control, and they were eager to prevent the Allies from gaining control over the entire island. An advanced striking force of troop transports and heavy cruisers would be assembled in Rabaul along with the 3 aircraft carriers of Truk. The forces from Rabaul would sail south, then split into 2 divisions. The first was to seize Lagi and the Solomon Islands. The second, supported by 1 aircraft carrier from Truk, was to capture Port Moresby. The remaining 2 carriers would enter the Coral Sea and engage any enemy found there. Once New Guinea had been occupied, then New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would easily be captured. In order to expand the Japanese front in the northern region, 3 islands within the Aleutian chain, Attu, Kiska, and Adak, were slated for conquest. The next stage in the Japanese advance would be the occupation of the American-held island of Midway, 1,136 miles west of Hawaii. Seizing Midway would secure an airstrip for the Empire within a range that could threaten the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Although the capture of Midway would provide a vital stepping stone in any future action against Hawaii, the operation would also have another equally important objective. It would be used to lure American aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor and force them to fight a battle that would end in their destruction. The strategy for capturing Midway and defending the American carrier fleet was a multifaceted and intricate amalgamation of invasion, diversion, reaction, and ambush tactics. The first step in the Midway offensive would be the dispatch of a Japanese submarine fleet to set up to reconnaissance cordons, one 500 miles west of Pearl Harbor and the other between Hawaii and Midway. As the submarines assumed their designated positions, a Midway occupation force, comprising troop ships accompanied by a division of heavy cruisers, would depart from the Marianas and proceed northeast towards Midway. In order to incapacitate Midway's defenses and stage an ambush against the American carrier fleet, a formidable carrier strike force was organized, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers backed by battleships, heavy cruisers, and a robust destroyer screen. The carriers and their support would sortie east through the Bungo Channel. They would be followed by a main force of 6 battleships. In the northern region, a second task force comprising carriers and transports, escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and battleships, would launch an attack on the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutians' operation had a secondary purpose. It would divert the Americans from the impending attack on Midway, tempting them to send the carrier north. In order to intercept any U.S. warships dispatched from Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet would be strategically repositioned to lay in wait. To the south, the Japanese carrier strike force would approach within 250 miles of Midway and attack the airfield, hangars, and shoreline installations. The invasion would quickly follow. As the Midway landings were in progress, the carrier strike force and the main force battleships redeployed 500 miles from the island would lie in wait. Upon the departure of the American fleet from Pearl Harbor and their detection by the submarine surveillance perimeter around Hawaii, or the long-range reconnaissance patrols originating from the Marshall Islands, the Japanese carriers would move into engagement. The big guns of the main force battleships would then finish the remnants of American sea power in the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Navy code JN-25 had been partially broken by U.S. naval intelligence. However, the cipher was complex, and many messages still remained difficult to understand. Commander Joseph Rochefort was head of the Naval Communications Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor. It was Rochefort who finally succeeded in adding a piece of the cipher jigsaw, vital to the Midway operation. By early May, Rochefort had a strong suspicion that a major attack was being planned for Midway based on partially deciphered Japanese messages. However, obtaining confirmation was challenging, and alternative interpretations remained plausible. The code that the Japanese used to represent the island was unknown, but was supposed to be the letters AF. Rochefort designed a simple ruse, which was given the go-ahead by his superiors, prompting Rochefort to coordinate an urgent request from the island for a freshwater tanker. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, an American listening post picked up a Japanese radio message, AF is short of water. It was clear that the coded messages referring to an attack on AF meant that Midway was the true objective of Japan's coming operation. Already, the Japanese plan was fatally compromised. While the Americans would face a significant numerical disadvantage in the impending battle, the efforts of the code breakers at Pearl Harbor allowed them to make a more precise estimation of the likely date of the attack, narrowing it down to a range between June 4th and June 8th. Knowing that the Japanese invasion of the Aleutians was merely a feint, the Pacific Fleet could afford to concentrate its strongest naval force in the Midway area. Moreover, being aware that Japanese aircraft carriers would be positioned in ambush, the Americans could disregard the invading forces and concentrate their efforts entirely on targeting the enemy carriers. The United States had a precise asset in the island of Midway itself. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and even B-17s could be stationed there to attack the Japanese fleet. As an unsinkable airbase, the island held immense value as a contingency landing strip for carrier-based aircraft that might be damaged or running low on fuel. In addition, Midway had 2 old but powerful radars, which could be used to help detect and track Japanese attacks. The United States naval strategy to counter the Japanese operation at Midway was meticulously crafted to leverage every advantage held by the Americans. The American defense of Midway would hinge on the ability of 2 carrier task forces to find and destroy the Japanese fleet. Task Force 16, based around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, would be the first to sail from Pearl Harbor. Task Force 17, with the carrier Yorktown, would follow 2 days later. All 3 carriers would rendezvous at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. As the Japanese carrier strike force approached the area, the problem of the Americans would be finding it. The radar systems on American carriers had a limited range of 150 miles. If the carrier's own reconnaissance patrols couldn't establish contact, the fleet would need to depend on long-range aircraft stationed on Midway Island. Midway's reconnaissance Catalinas would fly 700 miles out to sea in search of the Japanese. In the event that the enemy fleet was detected, the Catalina aircraft would shadow it until it entered the range of the Midway radar station. Midway radar would then keep the pursuing American carriers fully informed. An all-out attack of land and carrier-based aircraft could then be accurately vectored in to destroy the Japanese strike force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the strategy to defeat the United States Navy at Midway, assumed the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet in 1939. A dynamic and powerful personality, Yamamoto had little regard for the abilities of his superiors, and he was well aware that they were intimidated by his standing and his track record. Yamamoto's remarkable achievements as the orchestrator of the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent Pacific triumphs granted him significant latitude in formulating and executing offensive strategies. Yamamoto's resolve to have his strategies adopted was so unwavering that he often resorted to threatening resignation if his plans were not embraced. In his youth, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University and, as a graduate, had served in Washington as naval attaché. Knowing the United States intimately, Yamamoto greatly feared America's industrial might. Prior to the events at Pearl Harbor, he had made efforts to persuade his superiors about the potential risks Japan would confront in a protracted conflict with the United States. However, once he realized that Japan was committed to war, Yamamoto was determined to win it, his way. The destruction of the American fleet at Midway would buy Japan much-needed time. Yamamoto's aspirations centered on the concept of the Kasen Kantai, the pivotal and conclusive battle that would compel the Americans to engage in peace negotiations. He understood that a fleet engagement was a reckless gamble, but as an inveterate poker and shogi player, he was convinced that the only possibility of a victory lay in staking everything on just one card. Admiral Chester Nimitz, a gifted strategist and organizer, had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet on the 31st of December 1941. Immediately after the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. Nimitz held the belief that the tragedy at Pearl Harbor was not attributable to incompetence, and his subsequent policy of keeping all officers in their positions significantly boosted morale within the American Pacific Fleet. Nimitz's personable style of management plus a remarkable gift for trusting subordinates to do their jobs without interference would prove crucial in the battle ahead. Following the Pearl Harbor attack, it was Chester Nimitz who recognized that the era of the formidable battleship armed with big guns was coming to an end. He understood that the future striking power of America's Navy would be centered around the aircraft carrier. While under Nimitz's direction, America's carrier building system was accelerated, for the moment, he would have to make do with what he had, just 4 aircraft carriers and their support ships. In spite of his slender resources, Nimitz would stick to the tactical doctrine he had always advocated. For aircraft carriers, attack is the best form of defense. To the Japanese Navy, the outcome of the forthcoming battle was never in doubt. So far, the war had yielded an unbroken string of successes, and the certainty of victory was shared by all ranks. The confidence was so high that some flag officers harbored a genuine concern that the Americans might be hesitant to engage in combat and choose to remain within the secure confines of Pearl Harbor. One advanced seaplane squadron even sent a signal to its headquarters, requesting that all future mail should be directed to Midway. The results of war games simulating the coming battle were also ignored. When a scenario of this nature led to the involvement of American bombers from Midway Island and the subsequent destruction of 2 Japanese carriers, the final outcome was deemed unacceptable and was overridden by the imperial authorities. For the massive undertaking that would expand the Japanese Empire and destroy the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, Japan could muster almost its entire combined fleet. All 9 of the fleet's battleships, along with 11 carriers, could take part in the coming operations. Of these, 4 carriers eventually participate in the Battle of Midway. Akagi, or Red Castle, was laid down as a battlecruiser in 1920. 2 years later, she was converted into an aircraft carrier. In 1934, Akagi was extensively modified to accommodate 30 more aircraft, taking her battle complement to 91. Akagi was only one of 2 carriers ever built, with the bridge on the port side. Kaga, or Increased Joy, was originally laid down as a battleship, but in 1924, work began to convert her into a carrier. She was completed in March 1928. Later, Kaga's triple deck was replaced by a much lengthened single deck and a major refit. Her aircraft capacity was raised from 60 to 90. Soryu, the Green Dragon, was launched in December 1935. Built under the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, Soryu was small and cramped. Nevertheless, she could still carry 63 aircraft. And the design was so successful, she was the model for the nearly all later Japanese carriers. Hiryu, the Flying Dragon, like Akagi, had her bridge on the port side. Because of the universal tendency of pilots to veer to the left in emergency, the design caused many more landing accidents. Hiryu was, however, very much more seaworthy than her predecessors. Her complement of aircraft was 63. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was the most potent and visible symbol of Japanese prowess in the Pacific War. Purpose-designed as a Navy fighter to operate from land bases and aircraft carriers, the Zero would acquire an awesome reputation. The Zero had a remarkably clean airframe and was very light in weight. The result was high speed and excellent fuel economy. However, these advantages were achieved at the expense of pilot protection. The Zero had no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. More Zeros would be built than any other Japanese aircraft. The Aichi D3A Val 2-seater was the first all-metal monoplane dive bomber to enter Japanese naval service. In the hands of experts, the Val was a formidable weapon, realizing an 80% strike accuracy during the early Japanese conquests. The aircraft was constructed with such robustness and maneuverability that even with a fixed undercarriage, it could transform into a highly proficient fighter once it had released its bombs. Although the Nakajima B5N Kate was slow and poorly protected, it was at the time of Midway the best aircraft of its type in the world. On its introduction in 1937, it had boasted many advanced features such as folding wings, a retractable undercarriage, and integral wing fuel tanks. Effective as a conventional bomber, as a torpedo bomber, the Kate was devastating. The aircraft was armed with the excellent Type 91 torpedo. The Type 91 could be released at a speed of 200 miles an hour and from an altitude of up to 300 meters, providing valuable protection against anti-aircraft fire. The naval pilots preparing for New Guinea and Midway operations were seasoned veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had gone to fly on combat missions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. For Japanese pilots, the intervals between combat operations were entirely taken up by training. The motto was, train hard, fight easy. Japanese determination to achieve the highest standards in Navy flying had not come without a price. Pilot training was lengthy and expensive. Only 100 naval pilots graduated annually from the training schools, which proved insufficient to meet the continuous demands imposed on Japanese carrier forces since the war began. There had been no leave for Navy aircrew. The training of Japanese sailors and flight deck personnel was, if anything, even more arduous than that undergone by their pilot comrades. These men were conscripts, toughened by rigorous discipline and relentless battle training that ensured that a ship could be swiftly prepared for action stations, and a full strike force could be launched within 5 minutes. During the heat of battle, a flight could be rearmed, refueled, and airborne again within 1 hour. Although the combat readiness of Japanese sailors and airmen was unsurpassed, there was an underlying weakness in the Navy's preparation for the coming operations. Before Pearl Harbor, aircrew had been able to practice 4 bomb runs a day, and dive bombers had been expected to score 80% hit rates or better. There had also been extensive fleet maneuvers. Now, amidst the exacerbated fuel shortages that ignited the war, maneuvers and bombing practice faced even stricter limitations. At Midway, the consequences for the Imperial Navy would be nothing short of catastrophic. Soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it had become clear to senior American naval commanders that although the damage done was severe, it was far from the fatal blow the Japanese had intended. The Pacific Fleet's priceless aircraft carriers had escaped. The Japanese had been unsuccessful in their attempts to obliterate the ship repair yards, and they had overlooked the fuel depots at the bases, leaving substantial oil reserves untouched. In spite of Japanese efforts, Pearl Harbor still played host to a powerful American naval presence. Hawaii was the base for the United States' 3 Pacific Fleet carriers, plus 1/4 transferred from the Atlantic Fleet. Each carrier was supported by its screen of up to 2 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nearly 20 submarines protected the waters around Oahu and Midway Island. Due to Admiral Nimitz's conviction that the Japanese Navy's overwhelming superiority made it one-hit-run tactics feasible, the sluggish Pacific Fleet battleships were excluded from any role in the forthcoming operation. Those that had been repaired after the Pearl Harbor attack were sent to San Francisco to patrol the west coast of the United States. Everything would now depend on the speed and long-range hitting power of the American carriers. All three of the carriers that would take part in the Battle of Midway were the Yorktown class. Commissioned by October 1941, the ships were Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise. Although slightly slower than its Japanese equivalent, the Yorktown class was capable of carrying an extra 20 aircraft. Yorktown carriers were notable for their advanced damage control systems. In order to reduce the risk of firing during an impending enemy attack, aviation gas fuel lines could be filled with carbon dioxide. The carriers' decks were also specially designed for combat conditions. The flight deck was unarmored and constructed with 6-inch planks of teak, more easily repaired than metal and less likely to cause severe splinter wounds to crewmen. Unlike the Japanese carriers, the Yorktowns were all equipped with radar, which could detect aircraft flying up to 30,000 feet and at a range of over 100 miles. While the Lexington would not participate in the Battle of Midway, it would assume a crucial role in the earlier engagement, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lexington had been laid down as a battlecruiser in 1921 and converted during construction. She emerged as America's first fleet carrier and one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world. Because Lexington was a very early design, her available deck and hangar space was not efficiently used, and her aircraft complement was a modest 63. Originally conceived as a biplane carrier fighter, the Grumman Wildcat was redesigned as a mid-wing monoplane during the planning stages. The aircraft entered U.S. Navy service in 1939 and was manufactured first by Grumman and later by General Motors. Powered by a Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine, the Wildcat was slower than its opposite number, the Zero. Nonetheless, its exceptional maneuverability, formidable 6-gun armament, effective armor, and robust construction meant that the Wildcats could frequently endure battle damage that would be catastrophic for any other fighter. Nearly 8,000 Wildcats would see service in World War II. From its introduction in June 1940, the Douglas Dauntless was one of the most important American combat aircraft of the war. In the first half of 1942, the Dauntless saw more action than any other type. The Dauntless was a dive bomber with heavy armor, a bulletproof windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was powered by a 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone radial engine. Because of its great stability in flight, the aircraft was known affectionately to its pilots as the Barge. When it first entered service with the U.S. Navy, the Dauntless was the best carrier-based dive bomber in the world. The aircraft would take credit for sinking more Japanese shipping than any other Allied weapon, and during the Battle of Midway, it would be responsible for all Japanese ship losses. The 3-man Douglas Devastator, America's first carrier monoplane, had entered service in 1937, and by 1942 was already obsolete. It was slow, lightly armed, and had a poor rate of climb. At Midway, Devastators would suffer appalling losses, and the battle would be the aircraft's last major action of the war. The Grumman TBF was initially conceived as a replacement for the Devastator, and despite its rapid design process, it would ultimately establish itself as the most successful torpedo bomber of World War II. The TBF was a robust and powerful 3-seater aircraft. It was the first American naval warplane to mount a power-operated turret, and the only to carry its torpedo internally. The TBF entered service in early 1942, but only 6 were available for the Battle of Midway. All were stationed on Midway Island. It would be the TBF's first combat action, and in the memory of the men lost during the battle, the aircraft would afterwards be renamed the Avenger. The consolidated PBY Catalina would become one of the most successful flying boats of World War II, and the most numerous flying boat ever. The Catalina was unique as the first flying boat to feature cantilever wings which needed no supporting spars. It also had established floats, which could be retracted to form the wingtips in flight. The resulting aerodynamic efficiency made for speed and long range. After the first 4 marks of the PBY flying boat, the aircraft was fitted with retractable tricycle landing gear to give it an amphibious capability. While capable of carrying a substantial bomb load, it was the long-range reconnaissance capability of the Catalina that proved to be invaluable to the Americans during the Battle of Midway. Catalinas would also save the lives of many ditched American flyers. The B-17, a 4-engine heavy bomber, had first entered service with the United States Army in June 1939. Despite the aircraft's later fame as a strategic bomber, its original specification was actually for a long-range anti-shipping weapon, a role it would indeed fulfill during the Battle of Midway, driven by political considerations. The B-17E fully lived up to its designation as a flying fortress, intended to operate in self-defending formations. The B-17E mounted 2 hydraulically operated turrets, one of them a retractable ball underneath the aircraft. Altogether, the fortress carried 11 machine guns and was fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks and extensive armor. Despite its size and power, the B-17 had a low wing loading, making it more likely to return its crew home even when sustaining heavy combat damage compared to other aircraft of its class. In the Battle of Midway, 19 B-17s of the U.S. Army Air Force would operate against the Japanese. To extend their range, they would carry extra fuel tanks and half their normal bomb load. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had united the American people at a single stroke. Military and civilians alike shared a bitter resolve to see the Japanese totally defeated. Across the country, hundreds of thousands flocked to the recruitment centers. The impact of the Japanese attack had been particularly deep felt by the personnel of the United States Navy, and this humiliation had infused even the most routine training exercises with extraordinary level of intensity. Unlike the Japanese, whose trainee naval pilots were an elite selected at 14 years of age, the Americans recruited from a much wider segment of the population. In the United States, there were far more suitably educated recruits with the right mental and physical qualities for a carrier pilot. On America's entry into the war, the training schools were easily expanded without any appreciable fall-off in quality. After 3 months of elementary flying instruction, the aspiring naval pilots spent another 3 months in basic Navy training. Periods at 2 more flight schools were followed, and only the best were selected for training as carrier pilots. Despite the high quality of U.S. Navy flight training, American carrier pilots would enter combat with significantly less flight experience, having amassed just over half the 700 hours of flying time achieved by their Japanese counterparts. They had also, as yet, seen little combat. Some of them had participated in raids on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, primarily organized for training and morale-boosting purposes rather than significant strategic objectives. These actions, however, were relatively minor and encountered minimal serious opposition. As for the flight deck crew, American performance was at least as effective as the Japanese. The men were just as capable of launching a wave of strike aircraft within 5 minutes. Where the Americans did have a real edge on the enemy was in damage control. Damage control parties were highly trained in their duties, and their ability to deal with fire, the greatest threat to any warship, was unsurpassed. During the Battle of Midway, the comparative damage control abilities of each side would emerge as a crucial determinant in shaping the battle's outcome. By late April 1942, preparations for the Japanese campaign were well underway. Naval facilities at the port of Rabaul had been greatly expanded, and thousands of troops had been assembled, ready for the conquest of New Guinea and Tulagi. The troops' transports were ready to sail, along with the escorts of cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese anticipated little opposition on Tulagi, and once the island had been captured, the Port Moresby assault would follow. In both cases, the Japanese expected that surprise would be on their side. As the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, which had gathered for their mission, readied themselves to carry out their jobs, one to escort the Port Moresby invasion force, and the other 2 to assume positions in the Coral Sea, the Americans acted decisively. A task force based around the carriers Yorktown and Lexington was sent racing to intercept the Japanese. On May the 1st, south of the Solomon Islands, the carriers rendezvoused with a powerful force of Australian cruisers. The stage was now set for the Battle of the Coral Sea, marking the initial engagement in an epic confrontation that would ultimately alter the course of the Pacific War. The capture of the island of Tulagi on May the 3rd, 1942 was, as the Japanese expected, simply a matter of dropping anchor and disembarking the troops. Tulagi's tiny garrison of Australians had already been evacuated. The first blow in Japan's great campaign of expansion had apparently gone strictly to plan. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the American carrier Yorktown, with Admiral Fletcher aboard, had received intelligence regarding the deployments in Tulagi and was already underway, heading north. At 7 a.m. on the morning after the Tulagi landings, Yorktown struck. 40 of Fletcher's aircraft were launched against the Japanese fleet and the occupation force. In little over an hour, the American bombers and torpedo bombers had sunk or damaged the destroyer, 3 minesweepers, a number of landing craft, and several seaplanes. For the Japanese, it was the first unsettling evidence that American carriers lurked in the area. On already the second day of operations, events were already taking an ominous turn. By the following day, Yorktown and her escorts had already to rendezvous with Lexington. The 2 escort groups now merged to form a single screen around the carriers. They had joined forces only just in time. The Japanese carriers Chokaku and Zuikaku had entered the Coral Sea, and the 2 fleets were now just 70 miles apart. On the morning of May the 7th, the American carrier task force with Lexington and Yorktown was cruising on a northwesterly course. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were sailing on parallel course. Each fleet was unaware of the other's presence. American scout planes sent to the northeast failed to find the Japanese carriers, but as soon as they heard, the Americans launched a strike force of 93 aircraft. In fact, the ships sided with the cruisers and destroyers of the New Guinea invasion force, but soon after, the Shoho was spotted only 25 miles away, and the attack was redirected. Shoho was hit by 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes. She sank within minutes. For the Imperial Navy, the loss of Shoho was deeply traumatic. So shocked were the Japanese commanders that the invasion of Port Moresby was immediately cancelled and the troop ships returned back to Rabaul. On the American side, there was jubilation. A pilot's radio report of the Shoho sinking, Scratch 1 flat top, would become one of the most famous signals of the Pacific War. After the sinking of the Shoho, Admiral Fletcher did not immediately launch another strike against the Japanese invasion fleet. To attack the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku was his main objective, and in any case, the Japanese might themselves attack, and he would need his air defense at full strength. As the day advanced, a weather front closed in on the Japanese carriers. Nevertheless, the strike force commander, Admiral Tagaki, was determined to destroy the Americans before they could inflict yet more damage on the retreating Japanese invasion fleet. Choosing his best night flyers, Tagaki launched his attack in the late afternoon. The aircraft would have to return and land in darkness. The Japanese raiders, in spite of the poor weather, passed close to the American carrier group. The Americans, with the benefit of radar, easily detected the enemy formations and vectored their fighters to intercept. In a series of vicious dogfights, 10 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 11 more would crash after the mission, trying to land in darkness. For the Japanese, the raid was a fiasco. In the aftermath of this first carrier clash between the Imperial Navy and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, both sides considered attacking by night with their cruisers and destroyers. Both finally rejected the idea, fearing the absence of their protective screens. Instead, they withdrew, postponing the main action for another day. On the morning of May the 8th, the American and Japanese fleets were more than 100 miles apart. The Japanese had the benefit of low cloud cover, while the Americans were exposed under the clear blue skies. At 0600, both sides launched their reconnaissance aircraft, and within 2 hours, each fleet had discovered the other. On the American side, Yorktown and Lexington launched 70 bombers and torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. At almost the same time, Shokaku and Zuikaku launched 50 attack aircraft and 20 fighters. Although the Japanese carriers were close together, Zuikaku was hidden by a cloud, and it was Shokaku who fell victim to the Americans. She was hit by 3 bombs and so badly damaged that she would later be unable to recover her aircraft. Most would be forced to ditch into the sea. The American carriers, using their radar, detected the approaching Japanese raiders 70 miles away. 12 Wildcat fighters were scrambled, but only 3 reached a high enough altitude to attack, and no Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Yorktown was first to be hit. A single bomb found its target. The next victim was the larger and less maneuverable Lexington. 2 bombs struck her deck, inflicting minor damage. But far more seriously, 2 torpedoes impacted her port side. Even after the Japanese bombs and torpedoes had struck, Lexington continued to fight. But soon after the battle, she began to list to port. By pumping oil from one side of the carrier to the other, the crew managed to right the vessel, and she was soon capable of maintaining 24 knots. It looked as if Lexington might be able to reach home under her own steam. However, at 14:45, an explosion ripped through the carrier, and soon fires were raging out of control. The order was given to abandon ship, and after her crew had been taken off, a destroyer was detailed to sink the hell-blazing hulk with torpedoes. 38 aircraft were still on board. The destruction of Lexington meant that the Battle of the Coral Sea was a tactical victory for the Japanese. The light carrier Shoho had been exchanged for the far more formidable Lexington. However, the Imperial Navy had been far more badly damaged than it seemed. The carrier Shokaku was out of action, and Zuikaku's aircrew had been slaughtered. As a result, neither carrier would be able to participate in the decisive battle soon to be fought at Midway. In the aftermath of the Coral Sea battle, the Japanese made a fatal error. They knew they had sunk the Lexington, but they also believed that Yorktown had been smashed beyond repair. Even with 2 of their own heavy carriers out of action and the loss of the Shoho, they were certain that the balance was still in their favor. The remaining Japanese carriers, supported by battleships and heavy cruisers, would still have more than enough firepower to send the American Pacific Fleet to the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese main force for the Battle of Midway was based in Hashirajima in Japan. The main force was commanded by Admiral Yamamoto himself. Yamamoto had 7 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 2 seaplane carriers, 1 light carrier, and 20 destroyers. Attached to the main force was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, the most powerful carrier fleet at that time in the world. His heavy cruisers, Hiryu, Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga, would be escorted by 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Midway invasion force was commanded by Admiral Nobukate Kondo. Its main body was made up of 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light carrier, and 7 destroyers. Subordinate to Admiral Kondo was the Midway occupation force commanded by Rear Admiral Reisa Tanaka. Tanaka had 12 transports with 5,000 troops and a screen of 1 light cruiser, 10 destroyers, and 3 patrol boats. At the Guams and the Marianas was the Midway support force under the command of Rear Admiral Taeko Kurita. Kurita had 4 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. As well as his Midway forces, Admiral Yamamoto had an overall command of the Aleutians fleet. based in the anchorage of Ominato in the northern island of the Japanese homeland. The northern force was made up of a carrier striking force with 1 heavy and 1 light carrier, 2 cruisers, and 3 destroyers. There was also an invasion fleet of 4 transports carrying 1,000 soldiers, accompanied by a 7-strong destroyer screen. With the Lexington sunk and the Yorktown badly damaged in the Coral Sea, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been critically weakened. Yorktown went to the dry dock in Pearl Harbor with damage estimated to need at least 3 months to repair. In fact, the yards achieved near miraculous results. The job was done in 3 days, with 1,500 men working around the clock. How much minor damage had not yet been put right, and as the carrier sailed, scores of dockyard crew remained on board. Admiral Chester Nimitz, overall commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would stay in Pearl Harbor throughout the Battle of Midway. Communicating with his ships by radio, Nimitz divided his carriers into 2 task forces. Task Force 17 was commanded by Admiral Frank Fletcher, veteran of the Coral Sea. Fletcher had Yorktown as his flagship, 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers. Fletcher also had operational command of Task Force 16, led by Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance had the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with 2 cruisers and 11 destroyers. From Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz deployed 19 submarines for reconnaissance and attack, which would patrol off Midway and Hawaii. He would also call on aircraft based on the island of Midway itself. The U.S. Army Air Force had 4 B-26s and 19 B-17E bombers. The Marines fielded 20 Buffalo and 7 Wildcat fighters. They also had 11 Vindicator and 16 Dauntless bombers. The Navy had 38 Catalinas and 6 TBF torpedo bombers. The island was also defended by the 6th Marine Defense Battalion of 3,000 men. On the morning of May the 27th, the Japanese carrier strike force under Admiral Nagumo sailed from Hashirajima. By nightfall, they had entered the Pacific and were heading for Midway. The following day, the Aleutians invasion force and the main body of warships sorted from Ominato. At the same time, far to the south, the Midway invasion force, with its escort of destroyers and invasion support force of heavy cruisers, sorted from the Marianas. Last to leave port, on the 29th, were the invasion force main body and Yamamoto's fleet, each of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Although Admiral Nimitz and his senior commanders knew that Midway was to be invaded, for security reasons, no one on the island was told that the mightiest concentration of naval power in history was bearing down upon them. Piecemeal, Midway's marine garrison was reinforced and the island's anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened. Every day, the Catalina flying boats patrol the ocean around the island in greater numbers. Although none of their crew knew yet precisely what they were searching for. The Japanese, too, had begun their reconnaissance effort. An advanced submarine force had been at sea for many days, racing towards Hawaii. Its task would be to set up a picket north of Pearl Harbor and report the strength of any American fleet dispatched to Midway. The submarines were in fact already too late. On May the 28th, Task Force 16 left Pearl Harbor unobserved, followed by Task Force 17 on the 30th. Both groups vanished into the Pacific Ocean, and the Japanese submarines, which would finally arrive on June 3rd, would watch in vain. By June the 2nd, the Japanese Northern Force was plowing its way through the Northern Pacific, towards the Aleutians. The island, although of immense strategic importance to the United States, were sparsely manned, the only forces of any consequence deployed at Dutch Harbor. The Americans, expecting the Japanese attack, flew repeated reconnaissance missions, but because of poor weather, failed to locate the enemy. The Japanese at first feared little better, but a second strike group did succeed in bombing Dutch Harbor. Over the following days, troops from the Special Naval Landing Force occupied Kiska and Attu. Although the Aleutians operation was in tactical terms a complete success, and the Japanese occupation of the islands would be a thorn in the American side for some time to come, the primary objective of the invasion had failed. The Americans, instead of dispatching strong naval forces north away from Midway, ignored the diversion. A key element in the Japanese plan failed completely. While the Japanese northern force was launching its attack on the Aleutians, hundreds of miles to the south, Nagumo's carrier strike force was fast approaching Midway. 200 miles behind Will Yamamoto's main force battleships and steaming from the southwest, the Midway invasion fleet. With no cloud cover, the invasion flotilla was desperately exposed, and by now, Midway's Catalinas were sweeping a huge arc of ocean, up to 700 miles, covering all the likely approaches to the island. It was on June 3rd at 0900 hours that a Catalina made the first sighting of Japanese ships off Midway. The pilot reported 2 cargo vessels. 21 minutes later, another Catalina, flown by Ensign Jack Reed, and just beyond the extreme limit of its allotted search, spotted a large formation of ships. The message dispatched to Midway read, "Sighted main body," and a few minutes later gave its bearing and range. Although the distance, 700 miles, was within the capabilities of Midway's B-17 bombers, which already had their extra fuel tanks fitted and were armed and waiting, Midway's commanders were unwilling to commit their forces without more information. It would be another 2 hours of steadily mounting tension before a radio message confirmed the sighting of a large body of Japanese warships. Meanwhile, reports of the sighting were passed on to the American carriers. The 2 American carrier task forces were waiting 325 miles to the northeast of Midway. The Catalina's report placed the Japanese main body to the southwest. However, Nimitz was confident of his intelligence sources and certain that the ships were only the Japanese invasion force. Nimitz signaled his commanders, "The carrier strike force will hit from the northwest, tomorrow." Fletcher ordered the Enterprise and Hornet to change course, and both task forces headed south to lie in wait. With the sighting of the Japanese invasion fleet confirmed, Midway's B-17s were finally given the order to attack. At 12:25 hours, 9 bombers lumbered down the island's runway to launch the first attack of the Battle of Midway. It would take over 4 hours for the B-17s to reach the enemy fleet and begin their high-level runs. Because of their extra fuel tanks, the fortresses were carrying only 36 500-pound bombs between them. None struck home. From altitude, the effects were hard to judge, and the crews reported hits on 6 vessels, including 2 battleships. In the aftermath, the U.S. Army Air Force would claim a major victory for land-based high-level bombers. Throughout the night of June the 3rd, the atmosphere on Midway was tense, but confident. The reports of B-17 crews were encouraging. Everyone believed that at least some damage had been done to the Japanese fleet. During the night, a Catalina torpedo attack on the invasion transports did succeed in hitting 1 Japanese oiler. Insignificant in real terms, but heartening for the waiting Marines. At first light, Midway's Catalinas were once more dispatched on their reconnaissance patrols. Because a Japanese raid on the airfield was almost certain, the B-17s were ordered to take off once more to prevent them from being caught on the ground. As the Japanese carrier strike force steamed at 24 knots on its final run into Midway, sailors and air crew prepared themselves for the ordeal ahead with traditional toasts and worship at the Shinto shrine on board every Japanese warship. All were keenly aware that they were about to strike the first major blow in a battle on which depended not only on their own lives, but the future of the Japanese Empire. At 0430 hours, Admiral Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind and launched his first strike wave, 108 aircraft in all. The rest, including his most experienced aircrew, were held in reserve in case any American warships were discovered. Nagumo believed the possibility extremely remote, so only after his first wave had been sent to Midway did he order the reconnaissance aircraft to begin their search on the surrounding ocean. The search, mounted by the Japanese carrier strike force, was conducted by only 7 aircraft from 5 ships. Akagi and Kaga each launched 1 VAL at 0430 hours. Both aircraft were to search 300 miles out and could cover an area 60 miles wide. At the same time, the battleship Haruna launched 1 float plane with a range of 150 miles. The cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, were each dispatched 2 float planes. But technical problems delayed Tone's aircraft for up to half an hour, and one of Chikuma's developed engine trouble and would have to turn back. The search was dangerously incomplete. As the Japanese scouted for American carriers, the Catalinas were in their turn looking for the Japanese. At 0530 hours, a single enemy carrier was sighted. On Midway Island and on the ships of the American task forces, the effect was electrifying. The Japanese were exactly where Admiral Nimitz had expected them to be. Shortly after the first sighting, one more vital piece of information was received from the Catalinas. A wave of strike aircraft was approaching the island. To Admiral Spruance on board the Enterprise, it was a priceless piece of information. Soon after the aircraft had hit Midway, the Japanese carriers would have to retrieve them for rearming and refueling. At that point, the carriers would be supremely vulnerable. As the Japanese strike wave came within range of Midway radar, all the island's remaining aircraft were scrambled. When the enemy arrived, the runways and hangars would be clear. Midway's fighters would be waiting to meet them, and the island's force of bombers and torpedo bombers would already be on their way to strike back at the Japanese carriers. In spite of the valiant efforts of Midway's mostly obsolete fighters, the Japanese bombers and dive bombers broke through without having lost a single aircraft. However, as soon as the lead attackers came within range of the island's anti-aircraft guns, they were met by a hail of fire. Finding no American planes on the ground, the bombers attacked and destroyed Midway's oil tanks on Sand Island. At the same time, the dive bombers targeted the airfield and hangars on Eastern Island and destroyed virtually every building in sight. With 15 of Midway's defending fighters already shot down, the Japanese fighters were now free to strafe ground targets. They too met a murderous hail of anti-aircraft fire. In all, 6 Japanese aircraft would fall to Midway's guns. When the Japanese headed back to their carriers at 0643, it was already apparent to the strike leader that although they left behind a trail of destruction, they had not succeeded in their primary objective. By radio, he reported that most of Midway's aircraft had escaped, and the island's runways remained largely intact. Midway's bombers were still a serious threat to the Japanese fleet. Even before the strike wave had returned to its carriers, Admiral Nagumo was ordering a second attack on the island. Only moments later, there was a dramatic confirmation of the threat Midway's aircraft posed to Nagumo's carriers. 6 American TBF torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 medium bombers suddenly bore down on the Japanese carrier fleet. The screening destroyers and cruisers put up a storm of anti-aircraft fire. At the same time, 10 Zero fighters of Akagi's Combat Air Patrol swooped in to attack. The TBFs did succeed in launching at Akagi, but violent maneuvering saved the Japanese carrier. Savaged by the Zeros and by furious anti-aircraft fire, only 1 TBF and 2 B-26s survived the raid. At almost the same time as the Japanese fleet was beating off the first wave of attackers from Midway, the American task forces were preparing to launch their own strike waves. Reconnaissance had now confirmed that there were not 1, but 2 enemy carriers in the area. Such a target was simply too good a chance to miss. The latest reconnaissance placed the 2 Japanese carriers over 200 miles from the Americans. The maximum range for an airstrike was around 150 miles, so the first priority was to close the gap. Assuming that Nagumo's carriers would still be steaming towards Midway, Fletcher set a course to intercept. Only Spurance's Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet was to be sent. Task Force 17 with Yorktown would wait to recover her scout planes and follow later. If the Americans were to catch the Japanese as they rearmed aircraft returning from the attack on Midway, they would have to launch their first strike wave around 0700 hours. Although the range was closing quickly, it was still too great for the devastated torpedo bombers to strike and return home. They would be sent regardless. Those that survived the raid would have to ditch in the sea. Altogether, Hornet and Enterprise launched 29 Devastator torpedo bombers and 72 Dauntless dive bombers. For fighter, they were covered by 20 Wildcats. Admiral Spruance was aware that only 2 of at least 4 Japanese carriers had been located, and kept 36 fighters to defend his task force from any Japanese counterattack. As the strike groups from the Hornet and Enterprise set course for the enemy fleet, Yorktown, her scout planes now recovered, raced to catch up with Task Force 16. At 0838, Admiral Fletcher launched his strike aircraft. Within half an hour, the total number of American aircraft heading for the Japanese fleet had reached 156. Even now, the Japanese were still unaware that they had been found and targeted by enemy carriers. Nagumo's men were toiling to prepare their aircraft for the second raid on Midway, and the Admiral was confident his fleet was secure. His scout planes had been out almost 2 hours and had reported no sign of an American task force. In fact, Japanese reconnaissance had been a disastrous failure. By now, Task Force 16, streaming towards Nagumo's fleet, was well inside the search area of the Japanese scout planes. However, Chikuma's float plane had flown right past the Americans and had failed to spot them, because Tone's scout could not search the same area until the return leg of its flight, and had been delayed by half an hour to begin with. The error was not detected for a considerable time. When it was 0725, the pilot's report mentioned only enemy surface ships. As a result, Nagumo now believed there was no immediate threat from the American carriers. At 0748, as the Japanese were just about to launch the second Midway strike, they themselves suddenly came under attack. It was another raid from Midway Island. First came 16 Dauntless dive bombers, whose inexperienced pilots approached in a shallow glide. The Zeros of Nagumo's Combat Air Patrol destroyed half their number before they even reached the carriers. Next came Midway's B-17s, dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet. Not a single Japanese vessel was hit. Midway's Marine Vindicators were equally unsuccessful. As the American raiders headed home and Nagumo once more turned into the wind to launch his second wave against Midway, dramatic news was reported by a scout plane. The pilot had spotted a carrier. For Nagumo, the revelation could not have come at a worse moment. While the Japanese second wave was preparing to launch, Nagumo's first wave just returned from Midway was cycling, waiting to land, also waiting to refuel and rearmed with the fleet's Zero fighters, which had been in action protecting the carriers. If Nagumo were to launch his second wave against the reported enemy carrier, they would have to go without fighter cover. Nagumo decided to wait. He would return his second wave below decks, recovering his circling aircraft for refueling, then launch a full-scale attack on the American fleet. At 0917, with all their aircraft recovered, the Japanese carriers, up to now heading towards Midway, turned east-northeast to close with the American force. Nagumo's strike force would be ready to launch at 10:30 hours. As the Japanese surged ahead at 30 knots, the decks of Nagumo's carriers were chaotic. Flight crews struggled frantically to refuel and rearm their aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes lay everywhere, and there was no time to follow safety procedures. And unknown to the Japanese, who had no radar, the first American torpedo bombers were only 3 minutes away. The American air group from Task Force 16 that followed a course based on the assumption that the Japanese fleet had carried on sailing towards Midway. Instead, Nagumo had changed course. As a result, most of the dive bombers and fighters from Hornet, 45 aircraft in all, failed to find the enemy. A second group of Hornets aircraft had also at first missed Nagumo's fleet, but had then turned north and within minutes had found the Japanese carriers. The first target for Hornets torpedo bombers was Akagi. As the squadron swept in at low level, the Zeros pounced. The few Americans that survived were torn apart by the fleet's anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo bomber and only one pilot survived. Within minutes of the first raid, torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown began their attack. Once again, the American pilots were slaughtered and no enemy ships were hit. Only 6 raiders survived. With the torpedo attacks beaten off and his fleet still fully unscathed, Nagumo was at last ready to send his waiting strike aircraft against the American carriers. Just as the launch signal was about to be given, American dive bombers, which had been lurking high in the clouds, pounced on the carriers. The first victim was Kaga. The time was around 10:20 hours. The first bomb to strike Kaga landed on the rear of her flight deck, squarely amongst aircraft, armed and waiting to take off. 2 more hit near her forward elevator. Another exploded in the hangar below, igniting fuel and detonating bombs. Kaga was left a raging inferno within minutes, and almost everyone on her bridge was killed. As Kaga burned, Akagi was launching its first Zero fighter for the attack that was supposed to smash the American fleet. At that moment, 3 Dauntless dive bombers struck. The first hit on Akagi landed near her midships lift and exploded in the hangar. The next fell amongst the parked aircraft on her deck. Fuel and bombs ignited immediately, killing the elite of the Japanese air fleet in their cockpits. Within minutes, the fire had spread forward and Admiral Nagumo's flagship was doomed. The next victim of the American dive bombers was Soryu. Just after 10:25, 3 bombs smashed into the carrier's flight deck. The first bomb fell between Soryu's second and third lifts. The next landed in front of the forward lift and penetrated to the hangar, detonating bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. The third struck on the rear deck, completely destroying a waiting strike wave. In the space of 5 minutes, the mightiest carrier fleet in existence had been shattered. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship blazing, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Of his once magnificent carrier force, only Hiryu was left, and immediately the order was given to launch her strike aircraft. There was still some hope, but even now, a devastating blow could be visited on the American enemy. The first wave of Hiryu's strike force was made up of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. The target was Task Force 17 and the carrier Yorktown. Shortly before noon, the Vals were detected by Yorktown's radar. Already, 12 Wildcat fighters were in the air covering the carrier, and another 15 were on the deck refueling. These were ordered to launch at once. At the same time, Yorktown's aviation gas lines were shut down and her fire suppression system was activated. The Japanese strike wave, approaching at 10,000 feet, ran straight into Yorktown's fighter defenses. 10 were shot down by the Wildcats. The 14 survivors headed straight for the American carrier. 5 Vals survived the gauntlet of Wildcats and the hail of fire put up by Yorktown and her escorts. 3 bombs plunged into Fletcher's flagship. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck and exploded. The second penetrated and burst below the funnel, damaging all but one of the ship's boilers and destroying her radar room. The third bomb crashed through Yorktown's #1 elevator and deep into her hangar. In spite of being hit by 3 bombs, so good was Yorktown's damage control that potentially catastrophic fires were quickly put out. No fuel or magazines exploded, and amazingly, Yorktown was streaming at 20 knots and able to recover and relaunch her fighters within 1 hour and 40 minutes of the attack. By now, the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu had launched her second wave. A scratch force of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Once again, American Wildcats savaged the raiders, but 9 torpedo bombers survived and swept into the attack. Because Yorktown was no longer belching smoke, she was mistaken for one of the unscathed sister ships. Although 5 more Kates were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, 4 launched their torpedoes. Yorktown was hit twice on the port side, and one of the raiders deliberately crashed onto her deck. Within seconds of the strike, Yorktown was racked by explosions and began to list to port. At 1500 hours, the order was given to abandon ship. As the first of Yorktown's crew were being taken off by her attendant destroyers, aboard Enterprise, Admiral Spruance received news from a scout aircraft a Hiryu had been spotted. The Japanese carrier was 100 miles northwest of the dying Yorktown. At 1530 hours, Enterprise launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers and Hornet another 16. Meanwhile, Hiryu was recovering and refueling her last remaining aircraft for a third strike against the American carriers. At 1705, the Dauntless, undetected by Hiryu's combat air patrol, screamed down out of the sun. Hiryu maneuvered violently, but 4 bombs found their target. The first 2 bombs to hit blew Hiryu's number 1 lift clean off, and left the whole forward deck a massive flame. The other 2 penetrated to the hangar, where bombs and fuel exploded violently. The waiting aircraft at the rear of the flight deck blew up, killing almost all their pilots. Admiral Nagumo's last carrier was finished, and with her, Japanese domination of the skies over the Pacific. When Admiral Yamamoto learned of the catastrophe that had befallen his fleet, he did not at once abandon all hope. Perhaps with the awesome firepower of his battleships and cruisers, he could yet destroy the Americans in a night battle. Yamamoto was clutching at straws. That evening, American carriers sailed eastward, and Yamamoto could no longer force a battle before daylight exposed his ships to air attack. At 02:55, on the morning of June the 5th, Admiral Yamamoto ordered a general withdrawal. On the morning of June the 6th, strike waves from the Enterprise and Hornet added to the American tally of 4 Japanese carriers by sinking 1 cruiser and damaging another. With them, the number of Japanese dead rose to 3,500 men. On the American side, the cost of victory was the carrier Yorktown, finally sunk by torpedoes from a prowling Japanese submarine, and the destroyer Hammond that had been lying alongside. In all, 307 aircrew, sailors, and Marines had died. For the United States, the Battle of Midway would prove the turning point in the fight against Japan. Unable to replace her losses in carriers and aircrew, the Japanese Empire would never again be capable of taking the initiative. Japan had not only suffered the greatest defeat in her history, but had, in a single day, lost the Pacific War.
With America and the Soviet Union engaged in a massive arms race, both sides are eager to acquire the technology that will give them a distinct advantage over the other. Bombers, missiles, nuclear-powered submarines, and satellites launched into space are all highly sought after during a period where the entire world could be obliterated with the flip of a switch. During this weapons race, Nazi scientists are brought over to both sides of the curtain, where the weapons that at one time were to be used against them are studied and developed further in order to produce a checkmate against the opposing power. The names Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and Hermann Oberth are usually mentioned when this topic in history is discussed. For it is their work that gives the United States the X-15, a rocket-powered plane that reaches the edges of outer space and holds the world record for speed, flying at over Mach 6. The X-20 Dynamic Soarer, a futuristic space plane that is to be used for multiple purposes, including the bombing of the Soviet Union from outer space. Designs demonstrating America's commitment to be the undisputed champion of Cold War weaponry. And while the names von Braun and Dornberger are etched in stone as the architects of American ingenuity, there is another scientist who is often overlooked by writers and historians. His name is Dr. Jürgen Sanger, a brilliant theoretician who has bigger dreams and aspirations than all the others combined. His ultimate goal is to produce a hypersonic spacecraft that can take passengers around the globe in mere hours. He has a concept that Nazi Germany desires to convert into a lethal weapon to be used against the United States. An idea that is resurrected from the ashes of the Second World War to be used as a game changer for whoever can master its concept. This is the story of Dr. Jürgen Sanger, one of Hitler's spacemen. The story of Jürgen Sanger begins at the turn of the century in the nation of Austria, where as a young child he is infatuated with the idea of man landing on the moon. Like many others from his generation, the idea of space travel galvanizes Sanger, who reads as much science fiction as he can acquire during his impressionable youth. One book in particular that captivates Sanger is Hermann Obert's Die Rakete zu den Planetenraumen, or By Rocket into Planetary Space, a prolific blueprint of ideas.
He read the books by Hermann Oberth and all the other space travel books. Most of them were science fiction, but that's how he got interested in space travel, going to the moon, going to Mars, and beyond.
There was a lot of great scientists there with fantastic ideas, futuristic ideas. I mean, even Werner von Braun, who did the V2, I mean, his ideas were way ahead of anybody else.
Studying civil engineering at the University of Technology in Graz, he acquires his PhD in what would now be called rocket science. Sanger is a true rocketeer who, like others, must adapt to the new regime that is taking control of Germanic lands. During a period of intense military buildup, where Austria would soon be incorporated into the Third Reich, Sanger begins work on his magnum opus, a high-speed transport plane called Silbervogel, or Silver Bird.
It was his idea in the 30s, mid to late 30s, to build a high-speed passenger aircraft that could fly from Berlin to Tokyo in a matter of hours, or fly from Berlin to New York City in a matter of hours. It had nothing to do with a military aircraft. It had nothing to do with a suborbital rocket bomber. So the Silver Bird started out in Eugen Sanger's mind as a high-speed, high-altitude passenger plane. It's almost similar, I guess the idea would be similar to the Concorde.
When you watch a rocket, when you watch a Saturn V or any rocket take off, you notice it takes off slowly and gradually gathers speed. Well, this is because the most energy in that is involved, more energy than any other aspect of that flight is involved in takeoff. So if you could find a way to make that ramjet, this huge ramjet engine and this huge bomber, take off without using any onboard fuel, you'd really have something there.
There was a debate among the German and Austrian rocket enthusiasts about whether you would use a pure rocket to launch you into space or whether you would use some combination of the airplane and the rocket, using a winged vehicle. So his Silver Bird was an idea that he had, was one of many iterations of an idea for this kind of hypersonic or even orbital rocket plane.
It is a revolutionary concept. A vehicle capable of taking passengers from Berlin to Tokyo in mere hours by bouncing off the Earth's atmosphere.
Gravity would eventually want to pull it down. And so what Sanger would do, he'd fire up his 100-ton rocket engine, and he would dive down to about 25 miles altitude, where there's a very dense layer of atmosphere. Now, once this aircraft hit that dense atmosphere, it would bounce off of that, and it would be reflected back up again. It'd be like a child throwing a flat stone across a lake. It bounces along, skipping along. That would be the same principle for Sanger's Silver rocket.
Eugen Sanger developed a concept where you would launch a bomber, a manned bomber, into the stratosphere, into the high reaches, near reaches of space. And then you would re-enter the atmosphere and bounce back up and bounce back down, up and down. And they calculated that you could easily circle the world doing this with their 20-ton thrust Sanger ramjet engine.
While Sanger is not a man of war, his nation is on a path to war.
With all of these guys, you face the same issue, that they are space enthusiasts, but they're also nationalists. They're also, in some cases, quite Nazi in their beliefs. So there was no contradiction between their space enthusiasm and being asked to work on rockets as weapons. They saw, on the one hand, rocket weapons, whether it be rocket plane or pure missile, as duty, contribution to the nation, contribution to the Third Reich. At the same time, they saw it as a stepping stone to going into space. So they really didn't see much of a contradiction, if any, at all, between the two.
And very soon, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, a man who will be responsible for Germany's aerial arsenal against the Allies, begins to take a serious look at the possibility of turning the Silbervogel into a deadly state-of-the-art weapon.
The Third Reich was only interested in weapons. The space ideas are all very nice and exotic, but they funded Sanger, they funded von Braun and others because they wanted weapons. They were out to conquer the world, and they needed the weapons to do it.
Although the United States presents itself as a neutral nation, their president, Franklin Roosevelt, is sympathetic to the nations of England and France. And as the 1930s come to a close, it is almost inevitable that America will enter the war one way or the other. Unfortunately for the Nazis, there is no available aircraft in their arsenal capable of reaching the United States and back to deliver a fatal blow. By 1939, the best means available is Germany's U-boat fleet, who, when given the call, will engage in unrestricted submarine warfare against America's shores. Traditional aircraft, known as the America bombers, are being designed and built on the fatherland during the war, but remain a giant question mark in terms of range and payload. In a country with a fascination for wonder weapons, spending enormous sums of money on ideas and concepts that in the end may not be realistic at all, it is only natural that Sanger's grand vision is given the green light by German war planners.
When he started working for the Luftwaffe in the late 1930s, I think he looked for a way to sell this idea. The Silver Bird was supposed to be a skip bomber, a hypersonic vehicle that would be launched probably from a sled. It would go into a suborbital trajectory, and it could extend its range around the world by essentially skipping off the atmosphere like a rock.
A group of rocketeers are organized and funded by Göring, with research and development to be done at the Hermann Göring Institute, located north of Hanover.
Hermann Göring was involved in rocketry, and he saw what the Army was doing with the V1, the V2, and he said, "Hey, I think I should be involved in this as well." So he started his own group of rocketeers, men who he could find who hadn't been picked up and picked over by Dornberger.
So he started to invent and manufacture power plants, and these were in rocket and pulse jets. And from that, he also designed mini fighters with pulse jets, which then led to the idea that perhaps, we could actually go into the atmosphere and have long distances and bomb United States or whatever.
It is there where Sanger and his future wife, Dr. Irene Brett, a brilliant mathematician, begin working on the Silbervogel. On paper, the aircraft is to be launched from a 2-mile-long sled track where rockets will push the Silverbird to over 5,000 feet in altitude.
The Germans decided to use this to put a little vehicle behind this Sanger ramjet bomber that was just tied to the sled, to the electronic sled, and it would push this Silverbird off into the air at a good clip.
He'd have a 2-mile-long monorail that would be pushed along by probably 2-3 dozen of Werner von Braun's V2 rocket engines. At the end of the monorail, the aircraft is going almost 1,200 miles an hour. Once it reached that speed, it would take off at about a 30-degree angle and go up to about 80 to 90 miles altitude.
When the aircraft's power plant ignites, over 600 tons of thrust is generated in a mere 11 seconds. Climbing to over 130,000 feet, the target for its 1-ton payload are the cities of New York and Washington, D.C. Traveling at hypersonic speed, no existing Allied plane or anti-aircraft artillery can touch this Silbervogel on its voyage halfway across the world. After releasing its bombs, this futuristic aircraft will hopefully land on either Japanese territory or on the deck of a U-boat submarine. It is a grand concept, a project that requires years, if not decades, of research and development and vast sums of money in order to complete. Ironically, one of the Silverbird's biggest flaws comes from Sanger himself.
He had a habit, when he ever come up against a problem which he couldn't solve immediately, he would move on to something else. So consequently, Sanger investigated a lot of things, but he jumped around. He jumped from one idea to another, to another, to another.
In studying its design, those in the top German hierarchy have many questions surrounding the aircraft's rocket engine.
With the Silverbird being rocket-powered, there's no plan B for it. Once you ignite the engine, it runs until it runs out of fuel. And you have to, it takes you wherever you have to go, and that's the end. With the supersonic transport, like the Concorde or the SST, I mean, you can turn, you can land, you can refuel, but you could not do that with Sanger's Silverbird. And so, feasible, yes; practical, no.
Also, legitimate concerns are raised about the project's feasibility in a time of war.
The hypersonic vehicle requires an incredibly difficult exotic metal structure in order not to melt. And then you would have the trajectory problem of skipping off the atmosphere is difficult, not impossible, but very difficult. So essentially it was a completely utopian concept for the Third Reich.
This thing flies so high and so fast that how would you even drop the bomb knowing where to drop it and where it's going to hit? For example, the Silverbird, if it went around the world, and that's what it was designed to do, leave Berlin, fly around the world, and on the opposite pole would be New York City. You'd have to drop the bomb somewhere in Iowa. Iowa to New York City is a long, long distance.
He is a visionary, but not a practical man. While the V1 flying bomb and the V2 rocket are thoroughly tested on Peenemünde during the war years, the Silverbird is never able to get past the drawing board.
But it was all really fantastic futuristic ideas which in today's world could be realised. But they were so far ahead of their time that Germany didn't have the capability in terms of facilities, equipment, the technology even was still only on the drawing board. And it would have taken a lot of experimentation to actually realise the ideas.
I mean, this was a paper proposal, and I think in so many of the enthusiast, Nazi exotic weapons concepts that the enthusiasts love, have failed to see just how beyond the technology of the time. I mean, it would be a difficult thing to carry out today, let alone in the 1940s.
By 1942, with the war going in Germany's favor, the Silbervogel is cancelled indefinitely. As the Third Reich faces attacks on two fronts, cuts need to be made, and an enormously expensive spaceplane is one of them.
Around 1941-42, the Luftwaffe lost interest in this whole utopian project of Sanger, because Sanger wanted to scale up his effort to build a major rocket engine and so forth for his airplane. And that was beyond the ability of the Luftwaffe to commit, especially as the war situation got more and more difficult. And there was essentially a contradiction between spending a lot of money on Sänger for rocket development when there was already a huge rocket project in Germany, the von Braun-Peenemünde project.
With the Silverbird's termination, Sänger and Brett are assigned to work on developing ramjet technology for the fatherland. The aircraft appears to be all but dead. 3 years after the project's cancellation, Germany surrenders to the Allies. With both sides closing in from the east and west, Nazi scientists who worked on the Third Reich's wonder weapons become highly sought-after bounty. In the United States, Operation Paperclip is enacted in order to bring these men to America to begin work in their own defense industries. The same people who developed the deadly V-2 rocket that killed thousands during the Second World War now have their slate wiped clean as they begin their new lives, working for their one-time enemy. With tensions escalating as the Soviet Union becomes America's biggest adversary, they will need every advantage possible in order to defeat a regime that soon will possess both the atomic bomb and a delivery system capable of reaching the cities that Germany could never touch. Surprisingly, while hundreds of scientists are rounded up and sent to both sides of the Iron Curtain, Sänger and his wife, Irene Brett, go to neither superpower. Instead, they travel to France to restart their failed research.
Anybody who was picked up by the Soviets post-World War II, for example, if Sänger had been picked up by the Soviets, he had been squeezed like a lemon in order to get whatever knowledge and technology ideas he had out of him. He didn't want to go to the Soviet Union. Now, Sänger did not want to come to America in Operation Paperclip. In fact, he was never invited. Sänger was that small group of scientists in Nazi Germany who felt betrayed that the Americans had beat them, had defeated Nazi Germany, and that they were still mad, still angry with the Americans. And so Sänger, along with a few others, said, I'm not going to work for the Americans. I will not go to America. I'll go to France, where there's a more friendly work environment, and that's where I'm going to continue my career.
With the Soviet victory in 1945, its army begins capturing detailed blueprints of numerous German designs being worked on during the war.
When the Soviets overran Berlin, they overran the Reichsluftfahrtministerium building, and they copied every aircraft design that the Germans had proposed and were proposing to build post-World War II. They had all of these documents translated into Russian, so they knew every aircraft that Germany was working on or was thinking about in the future.
One plane in particular catches the eye of Joseph Stalin.
Stalin seized upon the idea about 1946-47 and was interested in funding it, and because it seemed like the magic answer to figuring out how to attack the United States.
The Soviets wanted Sänger. The Cold War was starting, and they thought, well, maybe one day we're going to have to bomb America, or maybe one day we'll have to bomb Australia. Maybe one day we'll have to bomb any other country around the world. Now, according to the documents that we have here, Sänger's suborbital rocket bomber could bomb any location in around the world. So they said, Stalin says we got to find Sänger.
The Silverbird, with all of its unique advantages on paper, appears to be an ideal weapon to use against the United States. And for that reason, he orders a Soviet espionage team headed personally by Stalin's son to kidnap Sänger and bring him to the Soviet Union. The attempt fails miserably.
Well, Sänger was tucked away in France, and although Vasily Stalin could travel all over Europe, he was more of a playboy. He'd go to Paris, and he enjoyed the ladies of the night. He drank heavily, and so it got to the point where he was more interested in the cities he visited and the enjoyment he found than finding Sänger.
It is suspected that the communists lose interest in Sänger's ideas as they discover, in the same way that German scientists did, that Sänger's plane is unachievable. On the other side of the world, where interest in spaceflight is reaching all-time highs, German scientist Walter Dornberger, who now is working for Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York, attempts to recruit Sanger, the same man who Dornberger criticized as a hopeless dreamer.
There was fascination in the United States with Zenger's Silverbird concept, hypersonic flight rocket planes in the 1950s specifically.
His crowning achievement can be seen in America's X-20 Dinosaur, incorporating a similar principle to that of his Silverbird design. A revolutionary spaceplane built during the Cold War, it is ultimately cancelled in 1963 due to both money and logistical problems. What becomes the beginning of the end for Iogan Sanger is his decision to go to work for Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Egyptians, developing missile technology. When it is discovered that an ex-Nazi is working for an Arab nation to defeat the Israelis, he is dealt a fatal blow to his career.
For a short time in the early 60s, he was kind of part of a scandal of, old Nazis and working on rockets for the Egyptians against the Israelis.
He was secretly working for Egyptian President Nasser, helping him design long-range missiles that could be fired at Israel. Well, the Israeli Secret Service found out about this, and Sanger's lucky he was never assassinated by these people because they were ruthless. Well, anyway, Sanger was alleged to be earning $500,000 a year from President Nasser. And word got back to Germany, German officials, and they didn't know what to do about it. Now, Germany at the time, West Germany, was seeking admission into NATO. And they didn't want any kind of conflict. They didn't want any kind of thing that was embarrassing. They wanted a smooth transition. So they decided that Sanger had to go.
Sanger would spend his final years in exile, dying in 1964.
I had talked with Sanger's son, Hartmut Sanger, several years ago, about this time when he was fired by the German government. Sanger lost all interest virtually in his work, didn't publish, didn't write, didn't speak. He ended up being a broken man, and Hartmut Sanger, his son, said that what had happened to him was the cause of his early death at 59 years of age.
In summing up the career of Iogan Sanger, one can describe him as a utopian visionary unable to turn his ideas into something concrete in the same way Wernher von Braun was able to do with the V-2 rocket.
Well, Sanger is certainly an important visionary of the 1920s and 1930s, with some influence on future concepts for hypersonic flight on rocket airplanes, reentry technology. He has influence. He's not technologically, little of what he did actually played out in something familiar that actually got built.
His inability to see things through would relegate his career to that of a theoretician, unable to capture the headlines the same way his colleagues were able to. At the same time, his contribution to rocket technology, to ramjets, to the lifting body, to skip trajectory, and to hypersonic flight can never be ignored. Had his Silverbird been completed, its impact would have been monumental to whatever country possessed the weapon. For that reason, Dr. Iogan Sanger, one of Hitler's spacemen, is in the history books as one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century.
From 1933 until the end of the Second World War, German aviation led the world in aerodynamic design and technical innovation. Long before the outbreak of hostilities, German industry produced an armada of technically superior warplanes. When war broke out, the Luftwaffe quickly overwhelmed some of Europe's most vaunted air forces. Classic designs like the Bf-109 fighter and Ju-88 proved to be superior fighting machines, while others like the Blohm Voss BV-141 became one of aviation's true oddities. Germany's plan for war in Europe called for an air force that was to be used in direct support of its ground forces. The Luftwaffe's task was to sweep the skies clear of enemy fighters, then destroy enemy troops and installations. Key to the Luftwaffe's success were ground attack aircraft like the Henschel 123 and Ju-87 dive bomber. Ordered in 1934, the Henschel 123 proved to be a rugged and reliable aircraft. It would see service well into 1944. Ground attack was only effective when good battlefield observation and reconnaissance could locate enemy targets. That job was given to the Henschel 126. With its excellent low-speed, short-field characteristics and outstanding all-round view, the HS-126 proved a great success in the early campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The HS-126 would see action on every front, but by 1941 its limited performance was beginning to show, and a new battlefield reconnaissance aircraft was needed. This led to some of the war's most unusual designs. The Blohm Voss company was one of the first to respond with their BV-141. Designed around the concept of maximum all-round view, the BV-141 was in many ways a problem looking for a solution. The unorthodox design featured an asymmetric layout, with the radial engine installed at the front end of a port-side tail boom, and an extensively glazed crew nacelle mounted to starboard. Unusual and radical in design, the BV-141 performed surprisingly well, but in the end it was considered too unconventional and it was cancelled in 1943.
Yes, in my meanderings throughout Germany, just after the capitulation, I was looking for unusual or advanced technology aircraft. And the 141 intrigued me a little, but I had heard that they were at an airfield called Großenhain, which was quite near Meissen. There was a big reconnaissance unit which had many reconnaissance types of aircraft, and I thought maybe the 141 will appear there. So I flew there, and there was no sign of one, but I asked if I could speak to some of the POWs who were in the cage there, and one of the chaps told me that a 141 had indeed been there, but the last he remembered of it was not too long ago. It had had an engine problem while flying nearby and had landed on an emergency strip east of Großenhain. So I flew over in that direction looking for this strip. But it wasn't really a strip, I found. It was a small airfield. And it was, by this time I'd moved into the Russian occupation zone. And I decided to land there because I had already found that that stage after the war, the Russians were still very amenable to the Brits because we had come in at the early stages of the war to help them. Anyway, when I landed, there weren't a lot of aircraft there, and there was a Russian commissar and with an interpreter, and I asked if there was a 141 there. He didn't really know things like the aircraft numbers, but he said there were one or two aircraft left, but his people had examined the airfield, taken away what they wanted, and the rest was left for destruction. So I said, could I have a look around, see what it was? He said, well, yes, why not? Because it's all going to be destroyed anyway. And in one hangar, there was indeed a 141. It had regularly had its engines run up by Feldwebel, who was available. And I said to him, was the aircraft flyable? And he declared, oh yes, it was. I rather suspected his motive, so I wasn't too sure of what he was saying or believing what he was saying, because I think he had hoped I would fly him out of there and out of the Russian zone. But the Russians were obviously not going to play with that. Anyway, I thought I'll take his word for it and have a go at this. And the commissar didn't object. He said, as long as I stayed within sight of the airfield and I'd only have enough fuel to do that, he didn't mind, because it was due for destruction anyway. And so he let me fly that, and I had about 30 to 40 minutes in it to try out this theory that it flew very nicely in a straight line when on an angle of bank of 90 degrees. And after about 2 or 3 goes at this at various speeds and heights, I had trouble with the engine, so I had to return to base. And so I formed an impression that it probably did what it said it could do, but its real reason for failing, in my opinion, was it certainly wasn't an aircraft in the same category of handling as the Focke-Wulf 189, which I had already flown and was its competitor.
Another odd-looking aircraft was the Focke-Wulf 189. The completely glazed central nacelle, twin engines and tail booms were considered too radical for conservative Luftwaffe officials. Performance, however, won the day. Known as the Flying Eye, the FW-189 proved supremely versatile, universally popular, and one of the most reliable aircraft ever to see Luftwaffe service. During combat operations, the FW-189 surpassed all expectations. Despite flying low over the battlefield and taking large amounts of damage, it had the ability to absorb punishment and fight another day.
So I think that killed it more than the theory that it gave the gunner a wonderful field of fire by having no starboard half of the tailplane and being asymmetrically offset to give a clear field of fire to the gunner. So that was my experience of it. Not very impressive, but interesting. The Arado 234 was a beautiful looking airplane. Aesthetically, it was very clean and looked dynamic, aerodynamically, very attractive. And the cockpit was unusual. It was a glass cockpit right at the nose, and it reminded me, when I got into it, rather of like being in a helicopter. You were stuck right out in the front there with completely clear vision around you. On the other hand, you were sitting pretty close to the accident if it had to happen too. And my first meeting with the 234 wasn't a very happy event, because this was up at Grove in Denmark, where we found a number of 234s, and I had one prepared for a flight by the German crew, because we obviously didn't have the expertise to deal with it at that stage. And I taxied it out to the end of the runway. I was well aware, of course, that the Jumo 004 engines, so fitted to it, had a scrap life, total scrap life of 25 hours. So one really needed to know the service history of the engines you were flying. Now, the Germans were very, very adept at destroying documentation, and we could find no service records. However, I taxied out to the end of the runway at Grove and revved up to full power, ready for takeoff, and then just about to release the brakes when the starboard engine exploded and totally disintegrated, taking most of the starboard wing with it. And this, of course, could have been one of two things. Either the crew had sabotaged it, or it was an engine with 24 hours and 50 minutes on it. We never got to the bottom of what caused it, but suffice it to say that I must have flown something like 300 to 400 hours on the Jumo 004 and various aircraft, and never had another problem with it after that. So it did not give me a poor impression, the 234. On the contrary, when I flew it, it was a very nice aircraft to handle, at a very fast turn of speed. It could fly at and cruise, and its top speed was 474 miles an hour, which was very high. And of course, it relied on this speed for its survival, because it had no guns fitted to it, and was purely a reconnaissance bomber as such. But as I say, handled beautifully. It was straight wing, was not swept wing, and made a very good impression.